Welcome to Sleep Theories, where we explore the stories that keep you awake at night. Before we dive into today's tale, I want to thank Todd Rockwell 3470 for suggesting this chilling narrative. If you have ideas for future stories, please leave them in the comments below. And if you enjoy these dark tales, don't forget to like and subscribe to Sleep Theories for more content that will make you question everything you think you know about our world. I took the contract because I needed quiet work and steady pay. The history department at a small European university had secured a preservation grant and needed someone to digitise boxes of neglected materials in a former monastery now used as storage. My task was simple: scan, catalogue and label. I lived by file names and checksum logs. If a page had a fold, I flattened it with a clean bone folder. If a binding cracked, I logged it for conservation. The job had rhythm and no one interrupted me. The basement sat below a chapel converted into a lecture hall. The stones were uneven and cool even in summer. The air smelled of old glue, linen fibres and iron. Fluorescent lights hummed with a pitch that faded into the background if I kept the microfilm reader running. On the second week I started working through a set of wooden stacks pushed against the south wall. The shelving had been there for decades, full of municipal ledgers, nautical charts and ecclesiastical correspondence. Most of it was dull. Dates, tithes, a survey of wheat stores during a winter no one now remembered. I shifted a tool unit to access a mislabelled crate and heard metal scrapestone. The shelf wobbled. Dust rose in a grey sheet. Behind it, a rectangle of wall looked wrong. The paint colour was slightly off from the rest of the lime wash. I knelt and tapped. The sound was hollow. Someone had built a shallow recess and covered it with a thin panel long ago. There were 2 sunken iron loops along the edge. I eased my fingertips under a loop and pulled. The panel stuck, then came away all at once, and a cascade of grit pattered onto the floor. Inside the cavity sat a small chest no wider than my shoulders. Iron straps curved over dark wood that had gone almost black with age. The lock plate was corroded to a dull green. I lifted the chest onto a table and brushed away the dust with a soft brush. As the grime cleared, an emblem appeared on the lid. A single rose pierced by a cross, engraved with care and filled with reddish pigment that had faded but not vanished. Below the emblem a date was incised in neat numerals, 1617. There was no key. The lock looked fragile enough to surrender to patience rather than force. I used a thin brass probe from the conservation kit, working the mechanism until the brittle spring inside surrendered with a small click. The lid stuck along the seal, then gave way. The hinges groaned. I inhaled the first trace of air trapped inside for centuries. Parchment, iron gall ink, beeswax. It was the scent of a time capsule. Inside lay a stack of folded manuscripts bound with linen ties and 2 small leather folders. Each bundle was marked with that same rose and cross sign, and a short label in a steady humanist hand. The top folio read, Nuptia Chimici. Beneath it, another label read, Colloquia de Reformatione. A loose sheet rested on top like a cover letter. The script flowed across the page with deliberate elegance. In the upper left corner, Anno 1617. The first line named a printer in Kassel who would publish a strange allegory that year about a figure called Christian Rosenkreuz. The second line asked whoever found these pages to guard them from unworthy eyes. The leather folders held sealed letters. Each seal bore a wax imprint of the same emblem. One envelope had a note written across the fold in Latin, warning that this message was to be opened only when an age of brass attempted to call itself an age of light. Another envelope held a mapped diagram of 7 stars, a set of angles, and coordinates written in a mixture of numbers and astrological glyphs. The paper crackled when handled. I moved slowly and took high-resolution photos before touching anything else. The next folio was stranger. It looked like a record of conversations among several learned men who met in private rooms at night. They discussed metals, medicines, and the reformation of the arts. They spoke of a brotherhood that would not rule but would guide, not conquer but correct. Their language mixed scripture, geometry, and laboratory notes. Paragraphs ended in short, cryptic maxims, many underlined in faint red. In the margins of one page, a later hand had added a date in pencil, 1909. Someone had consulted these papers in the last century and left a ghost of graphite dust as proof. I set a magnifier over a particularly dense page. The phrase that stood out was simple and cold. Tertia reformatio, a third reformation, not only of theology, but of governance, knowledge, and energy. The line that followed was worse. It shall begin when the world speaks to itself at once, and when invisible fires are carried in the hands of children. I stared at that sentence longer than I needed to. The interpretation was not difficult. A time when the world's voices merge into a single channel. A time when devices carry immaterial power and communication like bottled lightning. If it was allegory, it was precise. At the bottom of that folio, a small annotation appeared in a different ink. The span completes in the first third of the 21st century. There were no further details on that page. The next sheet offered a table of years, planetary conjunctions, and a set of initials. Some initials had been scraped away with a knife. Tiny curls of parchment lifted at those scars. The remaining marks hinted at a chain of hands extending across 400 years. Printers, patrons, collectors, and custodians. The names were incomplete, but the pattern suggested design, not accident. I photographed everything. For delicate items, I used angled LED lighting to capture the texture of the ink and the slight sheen of the parchment sizing. I logged each image by shelf mark I invented on the spot, then mirrored the files to 2 external drives. My process was rigid because the content felt anything but. The more I turned pages, the more this collection read like a map hidden in plain sight. Ritual language masked technical instructions. Alchemical recipes paralleled procedures I had seen in 19th century chemistry notebooks. The diagrams were not ornamental. They looked like apparatus schematics. Near the end of the first bundle, I found a letter that did not match the rest. The paper was thinner and the watermark was different. The handwriting was still early 17th century, but the tone was urgent, not ceremonial. It warned that a movement had begun and that counter-movements would follow. It spoke of false lights, counterfeit reforms, and trials by scarcity. It counselled patience. It predicted a final alignment in which the old world would appear to crack from within, and a new order of knowledge would be offered as relief. The writer had signed with a symbol, not a name, and added a line that looked like a test of the reader's understanding. The true fire is cold and is carried in silence. I read that line again. It felt like a riddle you only solve after you have passed by it. I looked back at the chest. The interior compartments were cleverly made. Under the lower bundle of folios sat a shallow false bottom that lifted when pressed along a seam. Beneath it lay a folded map. It showed a cross formed by cities, connected by lines at specific angles. Some towns were small in the 17th century but now were major hubs. At each point a symbol marked a specific building or square. It was not decorative, it was a plan. I lowered the map and carefully replaced it between acid-free sheets. The hum of the fluorescence seemed louder. I checked the time. 9:30. Upstairs the building was empty. My phone had only one bar in the basement. I took one more pass through the photos to confirm everything had saved. Then I tied the bundles with their linen cords, closed the chest, and set it in a steel cabinet with a temporary lock. I logged the discovery in my private notebook, but did not enter it into the shared spreadsheet. Not yet. When I climbed the stairs to the ground floor, the chapel hall was lit only by the blue security lights near the exit doors. The stained glass washed the stone with patches of colour. I paused at the threshold and told myself I would show the find to my supervisor in the morning, log it properly, and let institutional processes do their work. As I reached for the latch, I realised I had not decided one basic thing: whether the world was better off not knowing what slept under that wall panel. The doubt followed me out into the night. I arrived early with a plan: catalogue the chest, photograph each page in better light, have Professor Klein witness the accession so the discovery would exist in the system, not just in my notes and mirrored drives. I rehearsed the conversation in the hallway as I keyed into the basement. The night's doubt felt smaller in daylight. A formal chain of custody would keep me honest and keep the material safe. The steel cabinet door opened without resistance. The chest sat inside where I had left it, linen cords tied, bundles nested exactly as before. I checked the drives. Both had verified. I placed the chest on a rolling cart padded with foam and wheeled it toward the elevator, avoiding the tile crack that always jolted the wheels. The fourth floor smelled like coffee and photocopier toner. I pushed the cart down the corridor toward the small suite of offices that housed the department. Klein kept his door open during office hours, closed it only when writing or on calls. Today it stood ajar. I tapped the frame with a knuckle and stepped inside. The room was wrong before my mind supplied the labels for what was missing. No framed diplomas, no shelves crammed with conference proceedings and marginalia, no stack of student essays waiting for comments. The desk sat bare except for a university-issued computer, cables coiled neatly on the surface, power brick wrapped tight with a rubber band. The bookcases were empty. A rectangle of paint on the wall showed where a map had hung for years. The brass lamp that threw warm light over his manuscripts was gone. I checked the hallway. A graduate assistant passed with an armful of journals. "Is Klein in?" I asked. She glanced toward the room as if seeing it for the first time. "He cleared out last night," she said. "That is what they said." "Who said?" "Facilities," she answered, already shifting the stack in her arms. "They were moving boxes when I left. Thought it was archives. Guess not." I wheeled the cart to the reception desk. The department secretary looked up from her screen. "Can I help you?" "I need to log a discovery with Professor Klein. He's supervising the grant." Her expression tightened in a way that signalled she had repeated a sentence several times already that morning. "Klein is no longer with the university." The words landed with a dull weight. "As of when?" "Effective immediately," she said. "An announcement will be sent to the faculty list. For now, direct all grant-related matters to Interim Chair Halverson." I swallowed the next question because the answer would only be a shrug. I looked down the corridor to the glass case that displayed past faculty monographs and student prizes. The placard outside Klein's office had already been removed. The adhesive square on the wall shone faintly in the light. I pushed the cart back into the hallway and stood still until the buzzing of the fluorescent tubes filled my ears. The chest on the foam pad looked like a prop from a period drama. I wished, briefly and irrationally, that it were empty. I told myself to find Halverson, get a signature, keep moving. I turned left toward the chair's office and my phone vibrated in my pocket. No contact name, a university relay address with a string of numbers. The subject line was blank. The body contained one line. "They know what you found. Stop before it is too late." No greeting, no footer, no signature. I waited for a follow-up that did not arrive. I looked up and down the hallway as if the author stood there watching. My palms felt slick. I slid the phone into airplane mode and took a breath that steadied my hands enough to keep the cart moving. The chair's assistant told me Halverson was at a committee meeting until noon. I thanked her, backed away, and steered the cart into the reading room where graduate students transcribed microfilm. The room had cameras in the corners. Everyone pretended not to notice them. I did not want the chest on display any longer than necessary. I locked it in a side cabinet, signed into a public terminal, and checked the faculty directory. Klein's profile had been removed. The cached version still loaded if I clicked back through the search engine snapshot from 2 days ago. Title, publications, office hours, a lecture scheduled for next month. None of it existed anymore. I opened the email again and examined the headers. The relay masked the origin, but the timestamp showed it had arrived 2 minutes after I keyed into the 4th floor. I looked at the ceiling cameras. I wondered how many feeds watched our building and how many watchers sat behind them. I walked back to the basement to think without eyes on me. The chilled air steadied my pulse. I pulled a stool to the workbench and ran through a simple inventory in my notebook to keep my mind from looping. Chest. Contents intact. Photos complete. Witness absent. Chain of custody incomplete. Unexpected message. Supervisor departed without notice. The situation needed fewer variables. I considered contacting the grant administrator. Sensible, if I wanted to invite auditors and campus security into the room within the hour. I considered taking a full duplicate set of images off-site. Sensible, if I wanted to escalate a situation I did not yet understand. I compromised by generating encrypted archives of both drive mirrors. While they processed, I returned to the chest, untied the cords, and lifted one leather folder. The letter with the phrase Third Reformation lay where I had placed it between inert, acid-free sheets. I read it again, searching for practical instructions that might hide behind the tone. There were none. Only a discipline. Move slowly, weigh the meaning of symbols, and test claims against the world rather than against anxiety. I exhaled and closed the folder. Near noon I took the elevator back to the chair's office. Halverson stood at the window with a mug, staring across the courtyard at scaffolding on the library facade. He turned when I knocked and studied me with a professional's patience that had a hint of fatigue. "I am working the preservation grant in the basement," I said. "Under Klein's supervision. I need a signature to log a new accession." "Of course," he said, gesturing to a chair. Klein's departure was unexpected. "We will stabilise the projects as quickly as possible. What did you find?" "A locked chest built into a wall panel. 17th century manuscripts with a rose and cross emblem. The date 1617 appears on the lid and in the texts. There are letters and diagrams, Latin, humanist hand, possibly connected to a circle of writers around the Chimkle wedding." The words sounded calm in the small office. The mug paused halfway to his mouth. "You have them with you?" "In a secured cabinet downstairs. I wanted to document with a witness before moving anything to special collections." "Good," he said, setting the mug down. "Let me alert security and special collections. We will do this properly." He picked up the phone. His language was careful. He requested a conservator and a security officer for chain of custody protocol. He did not name the contents. He did not mention Klein. He hung up and scribbled a note on departmental letterhead that authorised temporary custody and transport to the preservation lab. He signed, dated, and initialed each line like a man who had fielded enough disputes to know where they begin. 10 minutes, he said. "We will meet you in the basement." I thanked him and left. In the elevator, I turned my phone out of airplane mode and found a second message waiting. Same relay address, same blank subject line. 2 sentences this time. "You have already told too many people. The faculty list is watched. Do not let them move the chest." The doors opened on the basement and I stood still with my hand on the cart handle, reading the lines twice, then a third time, as if repetition would make them less plausible. My first thought was simple. It is bait. My second thought followed too quickly to ignore. If someone wanted the chest in motion where it could vanish, this is exactly how they would move it. Footsteps sounded in the stairwell above. Voices. I looked at the cabinet key in my hand, then at the exit door leading to the loading dock. The chest sat 20 metres away behind a steel door that could be opened in 3 seconds. Institutional process walked toward me from above with clipboards and forms. An anonymous warning told me to freeze the situation or lose control. I rolled the cart toward the cabinet, unlocked it, and stared down at the dark wood and iron straps that had slept behind a wall for centuries. I slid the chest onto the cart, covered it with the foam pad, and pulled a canvas tarp over the top. The decision I made was narrow and exact. I would not move it out of the building, and I would not let it go upstairs until I understood who was waiting. The stairwell door opened. A uniformed guard stepped into the hallway with a conservator in a white lab coat behind him. Halverson followed, speaking in a low voice. I forced my hands to steady. I smiled like a person who had everything in order. I gestured to the cart and the guard nodded, already checking a form against a badge number. "Before we transfer," I said, "I need to show you something." I reached to the shelf above the workbench and pulled down the leather folder that held the letter about the Third Reformation. I opened to the page with the warning about false lights and counterfeit reforms and placed it under the angled lamp. The conservator leaned in, professional interest overcoming everything else. The guard stayed near the cart, eyes on the tarp. Halverson moved a step closer to the letter, then paused. He was looking not at the parchment, but at the cabinet where the chest had sat a moment earlier. He noticed the empty shelf. His gaze slid to the cart, to the tarp, to my hands on the edge of the foam. He did not speak. The fluorescent hum filled the silence like a faint, steady alarm. I left the basement hours later, after the chest had been formally transferred and sealed by special collections. I let them take it because refusing would have turned suspicion into certainty. The receipt sat in my pocket with 3 signatures and a timestamp. On paper, the chest was safe. In my head, I replayed the warning email, convinced that safe was the wrong word. The courtyard outside was sharp with autumn wind. Students crossed in loose knots, unaware that an entire life's work had been erased upstairs overnight. I turned my phone on again and found no new messages. The silence felt heavier than the words had. I walked toward the tram stop, intending to go home and sleep, but my body carried me past it and into the narrow streets of the old quarter. I wanted space to think without cameras in the corners of the ceiling. Here the cobbles were uneven, and the buildings leaned as if the centuries had taught them to share weight. I stopped in front of a church that had stood since the 15th century, and stared at the stonework. There it was. The same rose and cross emblem carved into a corner block halfway up the bell tower. Not big, not meant to be seen from the street. Weather had worn it down to a shallow relief, but the lines were unmistakable. The cross had equal arms, the rose sat perfectly centred, petals outlined in simple geometry. I stepped closer. Around the emblem ran a border of Latin words, abbreviated, hard to read where rain had eaten the limestone. I took a picture with my phone, angled to catch the last light. The phrase resolved slowly as I traced it with my finger. In tenebris lucet, it shines in darkness. I circled the church, finding 2 more symbols hidden under drainspouts and carved into lintels. Some were older, chipped by centuries. Others looked too sharp, as if recut in recent decades. And at each corner where a symbol appeared, a black dome security camera pointed down. Not the standard municipal kind. These had tinted covers, pan and tilt motors, infrared rings. I followed their line of sight until I stood at the exact centre of the courtyard, where the paving stones formed a cross pattern older than the church itself. That night, back in my apartment, I spread out printouts of the map I had photographed from the chest. The cross formed by European cities spanned thousands of kilometres, yet the proportions matched what I had seen in the courtyard. I marked my own city on the map. The church I had visited sat almost exactly at the intersection of 2 lines. I pulled up a satellite map and began tracing. Each city marked on the 17th century map had a similar church or cathedral at its centre. Around each building, modern infrastructure formed a pattern. Security cameras, municipal sensors, even new paving that followed strange alignments. I slept poorly. The next morning I walked a different route to campus and past a bank I had never used. Its facade was carved with roses arranged in a grid, each rose intersected by a cross. The carvings looked decorative to anyone passing, but I knew the emblem now. Inside the atrium, a mosaic on the floor repeated the pattern in coloured tile. By midday I had counted 7 sites across the city. 3 churches, 2 bank facades, a courthouse, and a government archive. Each one displayed the same sigil in some form, often placed where no tourist would ever look. The surveillance system bothered me more than the symbols. At every site the cameras converged toward the emblem, not toward entrances or streets. I stopped at a cafe across from the courthouse and watched for 30 minutes. The cameras rotated on a pattern but always returned to centre on the stone carving above the main doors, as if guarding it. Back in the reading room, I combed through the high-resolution images I had captured of the manuscripts, looking for anything that might explain the geometry. In the margins of one page there was a crude map showing 4 cities connected into a cross, with annotations describing angles and distances. Another page listed astronomical conjunctions paired with terrestrial events, harvests, plagues, wars. The language was cryptic but consistent, the belief that certain places formed a network, and that aligning them under specific celestial conditions would produce a harmonic of reformation. The diagrams looked eerily like modern network schematics. The next day, I rented a bicycle and rode to a smaller town on the outskirts that appeared on the map as a nodal point. At the town square, I found a statue of a robed figure holding a book. On the pedestal, nearly hidden behind ivy, was the rose cross symbol, freshly painted in red. I lifted my phone to take a picture. A man sitting on a nearby bench looked up from his newspaper. His expression was neutral but watchful. I lowered the phone and walked to the edge of the square. When I glanced back, he was still watching. I left by a side street, doubling back twice to see if I was followed. No one trailed me, but the sensation clung like static. That evening, I overlaid the 17th century map with the satellite map again, tracing the perfect cross across the continent. Each point had cameras, sensors, and recent renovations that seemed to align with the old geometry. It looked like a centuries-old plan updated with 21st century technology. The following morning, I found an envelope in my apartment mailbox with no return address. Inside was a single printed sheet. A new map, this one marking not just the cities but specific coordinates within them. At the bottom one line, you are seeing only the surface. Keep looking, no signature. I sat on my kitchen floor staring at the page. Whoever had sent it knew where I lived, knew what I had been studying, and wanted me to continue, or wanted me to dig my own grave by digging deeper. The next step was obvious. Find out if these symbols were local oddities or part of something larger. I booked a weekend train ticket to one of the other cities on the map. I told no one. The city was larger, more chaotic, full of tourists, but the pattern repeated. I found a cathedral with a rose cross motif carved into its western gate, and across the street a cluster of modern surveillance poles all facing inward. At night, under sodium lamps, the arrangement looked deliberate, ritualistic. In the plaza's centre was an old stone marker with Latin text half eroded by time. I bent to read it and felt watched. Not just by cameras this time, but by people. A man in a black coat stood near the fountain. Another leaned on a bicycle by the tram line. Neither moved, but both looked at me with the stillness of someone waiting for a cue. I left the plaza quickly and ducked into a side street, heart pounding, certain I'd been made. Back at the hotel, I locked the door and pulled the curtains. On the desk, I spread the envelope map next to my photos. Every line connected. Every symbol had been placed like a coordinate in a circuit. When I finally shut off the light, one thought kept repeating. These sites were not just historical curiosities. They were part of a system that had been built, rebuilt, and guarded for centuries. And now that I had noticed, someone was making sure I knew I was being noticed too. The next morning I checked out of the hotel early, still uneasy from the plaza encounter. The city streets felt alive in a way they hadn't before, every face a possible watcher. I kept my head down and walked to the train station, scanning for the man with the bicycle, the man near the fountain, anyone familiar. No one followed, or no one obvious did. On the platform I waited until the last moment to board and chose a window seat where I could see the doors. The train lurched forward, carrying me back toward my city. I exhaled only when we cleared the outer suburbs. 3 stops later, a man slid into the empty seat across from me. Mid-40s, hair neat, dark wool coat. He smiled with a kind of politeness that was practiced but not warm. "You've been tracing the cross," he said quietly, as though commenting on the weather. My hand went to my bag reflexively, feeling for the SD card that held every photo I had taken. "I do not know what you mean," I said. "You do," he said, still calm. "And you're not the first to do so. You have questions. I can offer answers, but only if you're willing to listen in the proper place." He held out a small white card. No name, no address, only a date, time, and a set of coordinates. The meeting was that evening, in a district I rarely visited. I turned the card over. A faint watermark of a rose and cross appeared in the fibres. "What if I say no?" I asked. "Then you will go on wondering, and eventually you will stop asking questions altogether. The decision is yours." He stood before I could reply and moved to the next carriage. I stared at the card until the train reached my stop. I debated for hours. Going could be a trap. Not going might leave me forever haunted by what I had already seen. At dusk I took a tram toward the coordinates. The address led to a nondescript building between 2 shuttered shops. A single light burned above a side door. I knocked. The door opened inward with a soft creak. A woman in a plain black coat greeted me with a nod. and gestured me inside without a word. The interior was dim and warm, smelling faintly of beeswax and old wood. The hallway ended at a heavy door. Beyond it lay a chamber lit by candles. At the far end stood a long table, where a dozen people sat in silence. A man from the train stepped forward. "Welcome. Sit, and you may hear what few outsiders ever hear." I sat on a plain wooden chair. One of the members, an older man with silver hair, began to speak. His voice was steady, measured, as if he had given this address many times. "The order has endured since the 17th century. We are custodians, not rulers. Our task is to prepare humanity for the next phase. We are nearly at the culmination." He gestured toward a chart pinned to the wall, a diagram of global markets, energy transitions and population curves converging on a single date. March 20th, 2033. "This is the horizon," he said, "the point at which the Third Reformation completes its cycle. The First Reformation broke the old church. The Second birthed the age of science. The Third will reconcile them both and bring a new dawn." Another member spoke next, describing phase transitions, engineered shifts in economy, energy and governance designed to move humanity from chaos into stability. Crises, he explained, were necessary catalysts. Recessions, conflicts, energy shortages, none random, all guided toward balance. I listened, torn between awe and dread. "What happens in 2033? I asked. The silver-haired man smiled faintly. "A synthesis. The world will no longer be fractured between spirit and matter, faith and reason. There will be a single framework, a single architecture of knowledge. We have been building toward it for centuries." The man from the train placed a small object in front of me, a token engraved with the Rosicrucian emblem. "This is an invitation," he said. "You may continue to observe, or you may take a more active role. But once you step beyond observation, there is no way back." The candles hissed softly. The faces around the table watched, not with menace, but with patient expectation. I turned the token in my hand. Its weight felt disproportionate for its size, as if it carried more than metal. "Why me?" I asked. "Because you found what you were meant to find," the silver-haired man said, "and because those who seek without guidance are vulnerable to forces that would twist the truth. We offer protection and understanding." The meeting ended without ceremony. The woman in the black coat led me back to the side door. Outside, the street was empty, the night air sharp. The token felt hot in my pocket. I did not sleep. I played the recording I had made with my concealed microphone, every word captured clearly. Their voices, their promises, their plans, all there. At dawn, I booked a room at a hotel under a false name and uploaded the recording to a secure drive. Then I bought a second SD card, copied the file and hid it under the lining of my jacket. If they were telling the truth, I had just listened to history being shaped in real time. If they were lying, then I had stumbled into a performance staged for me alone. Either way, I knew one thing with certainty. Someone would come looking for the recording, and soon. I left the hotel early, the recording still hidden under my jacket. The token sat on the desk, its engraved emblem catching the grey light leaking through the curtains. I hesitated, then pocketed it. If I abandoned it, they might think I had chosen a side. Keeping it might buy me time. The day felt too quiet. I avoided my usual tram stop, walking 3 extra blocks before boarding, and sat near the exit so I could step off quickly. Every reflection in the window looked like a watcher. At the university, I avoided the reading room entirely and went straight to the basement to collect my laptop and field notes. The cabinet had been opened. My notebooks were shredded and dumped in the trash can. The laptop was gone, only the power cable left dangling. My mirrored drives were missing. I stood in the centre of the room, breathing slow, scanning for anything else out of place. The dust near the cabinet door was disturbed, faint shoe prints leading toward the freight elevator. Someone had taken everything, except the SD card under my jacket. I packed the chest receipt, my remaining papers, and a few essentials into a small backpack. I left the building by a side entrance and headed for the train station, staying in sight of crowds whenever possible. The first train out was half empty. I boarded and sat facing the aisle, every muscle coiled, waiting for the sound of hurried steps. None came. An hour into the ride, I saw them. 2 men in dark coats stepping through the carriage door, scanning faces. They moved methodically, row by row. I left my seat, walked toward the restroom, and slipped into the narrow space between carriages as they passed. When the train slowed for the next station, I jumped off before it had stopped moving completely, hitting the platform hard and running toward the station exit. Outside, the air was cold and wet. I ducked into an alley, stripped the SIM card from my phone, and dropped it into a drain. Then I crossed through the side streets until I reached a bus depot and boarded a coach heading toward the border. By nightfall, I was in another country under another name. I paid cash for a cheap room above a tavern and locked the door twice. I uploaded the recording again, this time to multiple servers, and sent the links to an encrypted email account I had set up weeks earlier. Around midnight, the door handle rattled. I froze. The sound came again, a slow turn testing the lock. Then silence. I waited, every muscle tight, until the faint creak of the stairwell told me whoever had tried the handle had gone back down. The next morning I left through the tavern's kitchen exit and took a taxi to the airport. I booked the first flight to a distant city. No checked luggage, no digital trail. At the airport, I caught sight of one of the men from the train standing near security. He scanned the crowd with the calm focus of a professional. I turned sharply, weaving through passengers until I reached a different checkpoint. I boarded the plane with minutes to spare, heart pounding. In the seat pocket, I found an abandoned newspaper. The headline announced an unexpected closure of the university archives due to security concerns. The story mentioned nothing about the chest or Klein's disappearance. Somewhere below me, while the plane climbed through grey clouds, a network of watchers was still closing in. They had taken my notes, my laptop, my drives, but they had not taken the recording. I landed after dark. The city was unfamiliar, its language different, but that was the point. I moved through the terminal as if invisible, boarded a late-night bus to the centre, and found a room in a small hotel with no cameras in the lobby. Only then did I let myself sit still. The token lay in my palm, its edges warm from my skin. On one side, the rose and cross. On the other, a set of numbers, coordinates different from the first set. I traced them onto a page. The location was near the edge of the city, an industrial district. I closed my eyes, exhausted. I told myself I would ignore it, disappear, find a way to vanish into anonymity. But when dawn came, I knew where I would go next. If they wanted me to stop, they would have taken more than paper. They wanted me to see enough to fear them, but I was past fear. I bought a cheap local phone, left it off, and kept walking until the factories rose like grey skeletons on the horizon. Whatever waited for me at those coordinates was either an answer or the end. The coordinates led me to a crumbling factory complex on the edge of the city. Rusted fences, shattered windows, graffiti layered over decades. At first I thought it was abandoned, but as I circled to a side entrance I saw a single light burning inside. I stepped through a gap in the fence and moved quietly along the wall until I found a door hanging from one hinge. Inside, the air was thick with dust and machine oil. I followed the light deeper into the building until I heard footsteps. "Don't be afraid," the voice said. A man stepped from the shadows. His coat was worn, his face lined, his expression wary but not hostile. "You were expected," he said. "I was told to meet you if you came this far." "Who told you?" I asked. "The ones you met in the candlelit hall," he said. "I am not one of them anymore." He gestured for me to follow and led me down a staircase into what had once been a storage cellar. The walls here were reinforced with newer concrete. At the far end stood a table covered with papers, diagrams and strange devices. Copper coils, glass tubes, notebooks full of calculations. "This is what they guard," he said. "The chest you found was one fragment. They have hundreds. Manuscripts, treatises, prototypes. Knowledge passed down from before the industrial age. Knowledge too dangerous to release all at once." He handed me a yellowed page filled with alchemical symbols. In the margin, someone had written annotations in modern German. "This formula," he said, "describes a process for extracting energy directly from the magnetic field of the Earth. No combustion, no fuel. Imagine what that would do to the balance of power if everyone could build it in a garage. Another diagram showed a device resembling a modern MRI machine, but the notes described it as capable of healing cellular damage at a rate far beyond current medicine. They keep these things hidden, he said, not to hoard power, but to prevent collapse. Release them too early and entire economies vanish overnight. They believe humanity must be ready first. I thought of the charts on the meeting room wall, the date circled again and again, March 20th, 2033. That is the readiness date, I asked. He nodded. If they stay on schedule. But there are factions. Some want to delay another generation. Others want to accelerate. Crises are their levers. Financial collapses, pandemics, energy shortages. Each one forces society to adapt, to let go of old systems. I picked up a folder labelled Colloquium 2030. Inside were transcripts of meetings planning an emergency transition for the global grid to decentralised energy. The language was clinical, but between the lines was a recognition that millions would suffer in the short term. "Why are you showing me this?" I asked. "Because you still have a choice," he said. "You can tell the world what you know, but you will be silenced before you can prove it. Or you can keep watching, documenting, waiting, until the moment they cannot stop the truth from coming out." He handed me a small metal key. "This is for a locker at the central station. Inside you will find duplicates of what I have shown you. If I vanish, you must keep them safe." A noise echoed from above, the faint creak of the outer door. The man's face hardened. "They have found us," he said. He shoved the rest of the papers into a steel box and slid it under the table. "Go!" Through the back. There's a stair that leads to the old loading bay. I hesitated. "What about you?" He smiled faintly, almost resigned. "I've run long enough. You are the one who needs to leave." I turned and ran, heart hammering, through a maze of corridors until I found the loading bay. Moonlight spilled through broken windows. I climbed through a gap and sprinted into the night, not stopping until I reached the main road. I caught a taxi back into the city, clutching the key so tightly it cut into my palm. Back at the hotel, I collapsed onto the bed, listening for footsteps in the hallway. None came. At dawn, I took the first tram to the central station and found the locker. Inside was a hard case filled with papers, microfilm reels and a small portable drive. I transferred the contents to a cloud vault, encrypting the files with a passphrase only I knew. When I left the station, the token in my pocket felt heavier than before. The choice I had been offered was no longer theoretical. They had the technology to change everything, and they were waiting for the right moment to use it. I rented a small apartment under another false name, keeping the blinds closed and the lights low at night. The locker key never left my pocket. Each morning I spent hours decoding the manuscripts I had duplicated, cross-referencing them with historical records, energy policy shifts, and economic data from the last 20 years. Patterns emerged. A set of letters from the 18th century predicted the rise of steam power, the consolidation of banking networks, and even the redrawing of national borders after specific wars. Another series of documents listed critical alignments for the 20th century, with notations about global conflicts that matched the timing of both world wars almost to the year. The most disturbing discovery came when I deciphered the last bundle. It contained tables projecting events in the 21st century. The first line matched the global market crash of 2008. The second referenced a plague of the invisible air that would accelerate digital adoption, a line that could only describe the pandemic. But the final table carried a heading that froze me in place: Phase 3 Convergence. It described, in chillingly specific terms, an engineered transition between 2028 and 2033, controlled collapses of outdated energy infrastructure, a rapid introduction of decentralized power sources, and the rise of a unified global regulatory body under the guise of climate response. If these documents were genuine, they were not just describing history, they were shaping it. I printed the translated pages, pinning them to the apartment wall until they formed a timeline stretching back 4 centuries and ending 5 years from now. The further I stepped back, the more it looked like a single piece of design, one long breath drawn in since the year 1617. ready to exhale. I thought of Professor Klein, vanishing overnight, his name erased. Had he been silenced or simply absorbed into the network? One evening I received another envelope under my door. Inside was a single page, a copy of my own timeline, but rewritten in a different hand with a new line at the bottom. March 20th, 2033, completion of the great work. Choice must be made. No threats this time. No warnings to stop. Just that line. I realised then that the emails, the watchers, even the break-ins had been pushing me toward this moment. Not to frighten me away, but to ensure I understood what was coming. The next morning I walked through the city with new eyes. The surveillance cameras no longer looked like threats. They looked like guardians watching over a plan that had been in motion before my country even existed. At a small cafe, I opened my laptop and began compiling everything into one final document. The photos of the chest, the manuscripts, the translations, the audio recording from the meeting, the papers from the rogue ex-member. When I finished, I encrypted the file and set it to upload to a dozen mirrored servers. A progress bar crawled across the screen. For the first time since the day I moved that shelf in the basement, I felt strangely calm. This wasn't just a discovery, it was an invitation. The upload finished just before sunrise. I closed the laptop and sat in silence as the city outside began to wake. Church bells rang faintly through the morning fog. I half expected a knock at the door before I even stood up. By afternoon the files were gone. Every server returned a 404 error. One site marked the upload as removed for misinformation, another as violating terms of service. My backup still existed locally, but it no longer mattered. Someone had erased them from the public space with precision and speed. That evening there was a sound at the door. A single envelope lay on the floor when I opened it. Heavy paper, sealed in red wax with the rose and cross emblem. Inside was a letter, written in the same elegant hand as the manuscripts. You have seen enough to know we are real. You may join us, or you may remain silent. This is your only choice. No threat, no ultimatum, only a decision. At dusk I walked to the oldest district in the city, to a narrow street lined with stone buildings whose foundations were centuries old. At the end stood a structure I had seen marked on the 17th century map, a building whose doors had been closed the entire time I had been here. Tonight they were not closed. The great oak door was slightly ajar, just wide enough for a glow of warm light to spill into the street. I stood there for a long moment, the token in my pocket heavy as lead. I thought of Klein's empty office, the shredded notebooks, the candlelit hall, the man in the abandoned factory handing me the locker key. I thought of March 20th, 2033, 5 years away, and of a plan so vast it had survived kings, revolutions and wars. The door creaked wider on its hinges as if someone inside had been waiting for me. I stepped forward, hand outstretched, and then I stopped. Standing on the threshold, staring into the light, deciding whether to enter and learn the final truth, or walk away and keep what I knew locked inside me. The choice was mine. Now settle in, turn down the lights, and let me tell you about a discovery that changed everything I thought I knew about one of radio's most infamous moments. The August heat in Phoenix was unbearable, even at 9 in the evening. I'd been putting off cleaning out Dad's garage for 3 months since the funeral, but the estate sale was scheduled for next week and I couldn't delay any longer. The musty smell of motor oil and decades of accumulated memories hit me as I pulled the string on the bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. Dad had been a creature of habit, a night shift supervisor at the local power plant who'd spent his off hours tinkering with radios and electronics. Boxes lined the shelves, each meticulously labelled in his careful handwriting. Ham radio parts, 1995. Shortwave manuals, Electronics Weekly, 1990 to 1999. It was the box tucked behind his old workbench that caught my attention. Unlike the others, this one bore a label that made no immediate sense. C2C, 1997. The cardboard was yellowed with age, and when I lifted it I heard the familiar rattle of cassette tapes inside. Coast to Coast AM, of course. Dad had been obsessed with Art Bell's late-night radio show during the 90s. I remembered falling asleep as a kid to the distant murmur of his transistor radio playing in the garage, Art's distinctive voice discussing UFOs, government conspiracies, and things that went bump in the night. Mum used to joke that Dad collected conspiracy theories like other men collected baseball cards. Inside the box were dozens of cassette tapes, each labelled with dates from 1997. March 15th, Time Traveller Call, June 22nd, Mel's Hole, August 3rd, Crop Circle Expert. Dad had been recording the shows off the air during his night shifts, creating his own archive of the programme's most memorable moments. Most of the tapes looked well worn, clearly played multiple times over the years, but one stood out. The handwriting was different, shakier, more urgent. Instead of Dad's usual neat printing, this label was scrawled in what looked like black marker. Do not play, area caller. I turned the tape over in my hands. Unlike the others, this one showed no signs of wear. The plastic case was pristine, as if it had been sealed away and never touched again after that initial recording. My curiosity got the better of me. I dug through Dad's electronics until I found his old boombox, the same one he'd used for decades. The cassette clicked into place with a satisfying snap, and I pressed play. Static filled the garage, followed by Art Bell's unmistakable voice cutting through the white noise like a beacon in the darkness. You're listening to Coast AM. I'm Art Bell and it's... Let me see here. It's 3:10 in the morning, Pacific time. We're taking calls about government cover-ups and military installations. You're on the air, caller. What followed was 11 minutes of pure terror. The voice that came through the speakers was frantic, breathless, barely coherent. The caller claimed to be a former employee of Area 51, calling from a payphone because his home and cell phones were being monitored. His words tumbled over each other in panic as he described extra-dimensional beings who had infiltrated military installations across the southwest. I'd heard about this call before. Anyone interested in UFO lore or conspiracy theories knew about the infamous September 11th, 1997 broadcast. It was legendary among Art Bell fans, the stuff of late-night internet forums and amateur investigators. The satellite feed had mysteriously gone down right in the middle of the call, cutting off the transmission nationwide. But as I listened to Dad's tape, something was different. After the familiar abrupt end that every online upload contained, the tape kept playing. Where digital versions went silent, this one continued. I heard Art Bell's voice, off-air now. The professional broadcaster's facade completely dropped. What the hell just happened? We just lost the uplink. Jim, are you getting anything from the satellite? Nothing. Nothing at all. There was shuffling, muffled conversation in the background. Someone doesn't want this heard. Get me the engineer, now. More static, then Art's voice again. Quieter now, as if he was speaking directly into his microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing technical difficulties. We seem to have lost our satellite feed. For those of you listening on terrestrial radio, we'll be back after this brief interruption. The tape clicked off. I sat in the sweltering garage staring at the boombox. This segment had never been rebroadcast. I'd scoured the internet over the years, listening to every available version of that infamous call, and none of them contained what I'd just heard. Art's genuine confusion, his immediate suspicion that the cut-off was deliberate. It had all been edited out of every subsequent broadcast and internet upload. Why had Dad recorded this? More importantly, why had he labelled it with that warning? Do not play. But he'd saved it for 28 years. I rewound the tape and played it again, this time focusing on the background. Beneath the caller's frantic voice and Art's responses, there was something else. A low hum, almost subsonic. threading through the entire recording like a hidden frequency. The hum wasn't random, it had a pattern, rising and falling in subtle waves that seemed almost purposeful. Sleep eluded me that night. I lay in bed, replaying the tape over and over in my mind, especially those final moments when Art Bell seemed genuinely shaken. By dawn, I was at my computer, diving deep into coast-to-coast AM archives and fan sites. The September 11th, 1997 call had inspired dozens of forum threads over the years. Most dismissed it as an elaborate hoax, but several listeners from that night remembered details that matched what I'd heard on Dad's tape. References to the sudden satellite failure, speculation about government interference, debates about whether the caller's panic was genuine or scripted. One forum thread from 1999 caught my attention. The original post had been deleted, but the replies remained. Did anyone else notice the background frequency during the Area 51 call? My friend who's into ham radio thinks there might be coordinates embedded in the hum. Coordinates to what? That's what we're trying to figure out. He's been working on it for weeks. Has he found anything? He thinks it's somewhere in Nevada, near Groom Lake. The thread ended there, with no follow-up posts. The username of the original poster was listed as Desert Listener 97, but the account had been deleted years ago. I spent the next 3 days obsessing over that forum thread and others like it. Ham radio operators in the late 90s had apparently been analysing the background hum of the transmission, attempting to decode what they believed was hidden data. Most of the technical discussions were beyond my understanding, but the consensus seemed to be that the signal contained some kind of encoded coordinates, all pointing to a specific location in the Nevada desert. I found a more recent post from 2018 on a UFO research site. A user named Radio Hawk claimed to have finally decoded the coordinates from a high-quality recording of the original broadcast. After 20 years of analysis, I'm confident the embedded signal points to 37.2431 degrees north, 115.7930 degrees west. That's about 15 miles south of Groom Lake, near Papoose Dry Lake. Bob Lazar's alleged S4 facility would be in this general area. I plugged the coordinates into Google Maps. The location was in the middle of nowhere, a patch of desert scrubland surrounded by restricted military airspace. But it was accessible via a network of dirt roads that branched off from the extraterrestrial highway. The rational part of my mind knew this was insane. I was chasing coordinates that may or may not have been encoded in a 28-year-old radio broadcast by people who were probably conspiracy theorists themselves. But the tape in Dad's garage nagged at me. Why had he kept it? Why the warning not to play it? And why did Art Bell sound so genuinely disturbed by the sudden satellite failure? By Friday morning, I'd made my decision. I loaded camping gear into my SUV, printed out maps of the area around Rachel, Nevada, and began the 5-hour drive north into the desert. The little alien sat like a lonely outpost on Nevada's extraterrestrial highway, its weather-beaten sign promising earthly food for extraterrestrial appetites. I pulled into the gravel parking lot just as the sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains, painting the desert in shades of amber and rust. Inside, the restaurant was exactly what I'd expected, a shrine to UFO culture with alien memorabilia covering every available surface. Faded photographs of supposed UFO sightings shared wall space with newspaper clippings about Area 51 and signed pictures of celebrities who'd visited over the years. The owner, a weathered man in his 70s named Joe, poured me coffee that looked like it had been brewing since the Clinton administration. When I mentioned I was researching the 1997 coast-to-coast AM call, his eyes lit up with recognition. "Oh, hell yes, I remember that call," he said, settling onto the stool behind the counter. That was something else. Had folks driving out here for months afterward, all wanting to go skywatch where they thought the caller might have been transmitting from. "Did anyone ever find anything?" Joe chuckled. "Depends on what you mean by find." A couple weeks after that broadcast, we had this group of ham radio guys show up with all kinds of equipment. They'd been tracking radio signals, claimed they'd narrowed down where the call came from, spent 3 days out in the desert with their gear. What did they find? That's the funny thing. They found an old military relay station about 20 miles south of here. Been abandoned for years, but according to them it was still powered up. running on backup batteries that should have died decades ago. My heart rate quickened. Do you know exactly where? Joe studied me for a moment, then reached under the counter and pulled out a worn road atlas. He flipped to the Nevada section and pointed to a spot marked with a faded X in pencil. Right about here. But I gotta warn you, folks who went looking for that place, some of them came back pretty spooked. One old-timer told me they shut down that relay station a couple of years after the call, said it was obsolete, but he swore he could still hear things out there after dark, like power humming under the sand. I memorised the location on the map and bought Joe's coffee and a prepackaged sandwich for the road. As I was leaving, he called out, "You be careful out there. Desert's got a way of keeping secrets, and sometimes secrets don't want to be found." The dirt road to the coordinates was rougher than Google Maps had suggested. My SUV bounced and lurched over washouts and rock fields as the sun disappeared behind the mountains, leaving me navigating by headlights and GPS. After an hour of slow, careful driving, my headlights illuminated a chain-link fence topped with rusted barbed wire. Beyond the fence, barely visible in the darkness, stood the silhouette of a low concrete building. The fence had been cut years ago, probably by previous visitors following the same trail I was on. I slipped through the gap and approached the building with my flashlight, noting the faded military markings on the concrete walls and the collapsed section of roof that had partially caved in from decades of neglect. But as I got closer, I noticed something that didn't fit the narrative of decades-long abandonment. A thin line of light was visible beneath what remained of the building's front door. The door hung askew on its hinges, and I had to push aside debris to squeeze inside. My flashlight beam revealed a single room filled with obsolete communications equipment, radio panels, frequency monitors, and banks of switches that looked like they belonged in a 1960s NASA control room. And in the centre of it all, impossibly, was a radio console that was still active. Green lights blinked steadily on the panel, and a low hum emanated from speakers mounted on the wall. According to a digital display, the system was running on backup power. Backup power that, according to the date stamps on nearby equipment, should have failed sometime in the early 2000s. I approached the console carefully, as if it might disappear if I moved too quickly. The main panel had been modified extensively, with additional wiring and components that looked far more modern than the rest of the equipment. Someone had been maintaining this system, upgrading it, keeping it operational long after the military had supposedly abandoned the site. A locked drawer in the console's base caught my attention. The lock was old and corroded, and after a few minutes with my multi-tool it clicked open. Inside were logbooks and communication records dating back to 1997. My hands shook as I flipped through pages of entries, most of them routine maintenance reports and signal tests, but the entries for September 1997 were different. September 11th, 1997, 0310 PST. Unauthorized transmission detected on backup frequency. Signal traced to mobile source within restricted airspace. September 11th, 1997, 0318 PST. Rapid response team dispatched to intercept source. September 11th, 1997, 0325 PST. Source signal terminated. Interference event confirmed. Recommend protocol enhancement. September 12th, 1997. All records classified under Project Nightfall. Station decommissioned pending investigation. But the entries didn't stop there. They continued monthly, sometimes weekly, all the way up to the present day. Someone had been monitoring this location continuously for nearly 3 decades, documenting what they called recurring transmissions and pattern analysis. The most recent entry was dated just 2 weeks ago, August 15th, 2025. Annual transmission confirmed. Signal strength increasing. Pattern suggests escalation timeline. Recommend continued monitoring through September event window. Annual transmission September event window. I photographed every page with my phone, my pulse racing as the implications became clear. The 1997 call hadn't been a one-time event. According to these logs, it had been repeating every year, broadcasting from the same location on the same date at the same time. But that was impossible. The original caller, if he was real, would be in his 70s by now, assuming he'd survived whatever had terrified him so badly in 1997. And if he was dead, who was continuing to broadcast his message. I was so absorbed in photographing the logbook entries that I didn't hear the approaching vehicle until its headlights swept across the building's interior. I quickly stuffed the logbooks back into the drawer and grabbed my flashlight, but it was too late to slip away unnoticed. The truck's engine shut off outside and I heard footsteps approaching the building. A gravelly voice called out, "I know you're in there. Come on out slow and keep your hands where I can see them." I emerged from the building with my hands raised, squinting against the glare of a powerful flashlight. Behind it, I could make out the silhouette of a man in a wide-brimmed hat, standing next to a dust-covered pickup truck. "You another one of those internet investigators?" he asked, lowering the flashlight slightly. In the reduced glare, I could see he was in his 60s, with the weathered face of someone who had spent decades in the desert sun. "Just curious about this place," I replied carefully. "I heard about it from some old forum posts." He chuckled, but there was no humour in it. "Curious. That's what they all say." He gestured toward the building. "Find anything interesting in there?" "Just old military equipment. Most of it's been stripped out." But not all of it. It wasn't a question. He studied me for a long moment, then seemed to reach some kind of decision. "Name's Tom Briggs, retired Air Force. Spent 20 years working radio triangulation and signal intelligence out of Nellis." "What brings you out here?" "Same thing that brings all of you eventually. That goddamn radio call." He leaned against his truck, suddenly looking every one of his 60-plus years. "I was on duty that night in '97, working the monitoring station. We tracked that transmission in real time." My heart nearly stopped. "You were there." "Not there," he said, pointing toward the building, "but I was part of the team that pinpointed where it came from. And I can tell you right now, it didn't come from some payphone like everyone thinks." "Where did it come from?" Tom was quiet for so long I thought he wasn't going to answer. Finally he sighed. "Signal originated from inside restricted airspace, about 2 miles above this exact location, moving at approximately 80 miles per hour in a northwesterly direction." "Moving? Like from an aircraft?" That's what we thought at first. But no aircraft was supposed to be in that airspace, and the signal characteristics. He shook his head. Damn thing was broadcasting on frequencies that weren't even commercially available in 1997. The transmission equipment would have had to be decades ahead of anything we had at the time. I felt like the ground was shifting beneath my feet. "Are you saying the caller wasn't human?" Tom's laugh was bitter. "I'm saying the caller wasn't calling from Earth, at least not from the surface, whether he was human or not. That's above my pay grade, but I can tell you this. We tracked similar signals every year after that. Same date, same time, same general area. Always from altitude, always moving. Every year. Every September 11th, 3:10 a.m. Pacific, like clockwork." He pushed himself off the truck and walked toward me. "I've been coming out here for the anniversary for the past decade, ever since I retired. Call it professional curiosity." "Have you ever heard the transmission yourself?" "Not directly, but I've got equipment in the truck that can pick up the signal when it broadcasts." He paused. "Which, according to my calculations, should be happening in about 6 hours. I stared at him. "Tonight?" "Tonight's September 11th, isn't it? And if you're out here with questions about that old coast-to-coast call, then you've already been logged by whoever's been monitoring this site. Might as well stick around and see what happens." The casual way he mentioned being logged sent a chill down my spine. "What do you mean, logged?" Tom pointed toward the building. "That radio console in there is not just receiving signals. It's been transmitting location data on everyone who visits this site for the past 28 years. License plates, cell phone signatures, facial recognition if you get close enough to the building." I instinctively took a step back. "Transmitting to who?" "Wish I knew. But whoever's been maintaining this place, they've got resources and technology that goes way beyond amateur radio enthusiasts." He studied my face in the dim light. "If you heard that call and came looking, then you're part of whatever's happening here now. Question is, are you ready to find out what that means?" Tom's truck was equipped with enough radio and monitoring equipment to stock a small electronics store. While he prepared his receivers, I set up my camping gear at what he assured me was a safe distance from the building. Close enough to observe, far enough away to avoid whatever scanning equipment might be hidden inside. As midnight approached, Tom became increasingly focused on his instruments, adjusting frequencies and checking signal strength indicators. I tried to make conversation, but he was clearly in professional mode now, decades of military training taking over. "You ever think about what the caller was really warning about?" I asked as we waited in the darkness. "Every day for 28 years, Tom replied without looking up from his equipment. "But I've learned that sometimes the warning isn't meant for the people who hear it first. Sometimes it's meant for the people who come looking later." At 2:30 a.m, Tom's equipment began detecting anomalies. Radio frequencies that had been silent all evening suddenly came alive with activity, though nothing we could hear clearly. Just bursts of what sounded like digital data transmission. "Something's coming," Tom said quietly. "Whatever's been broadcasting that signal, it's powering up." At exactly 3:09 a.m, every piece of radio equipment in Tom's truck went silent. The sudden absence of static and background hum was more unsettling than any sound could have been. "Here we go," Tom whispered. At 3:10 a.m, my shortwave radio crackled to life. The voice that emerged from the speakers was exactly the same as the one I'd heard on Dad's tape. The same frantic, breathless panic. The same desperate words spilling over each other in fear. But this wasn't a recording. The signal was live, broadcasting in real time with all the characteristics of a current transmission. "Hello? Hello? Is anybody out there? This is... I can't tell you my name. They're listening. They're always listening. I used to work at Area 51, at the facility they call S4. I need to tell someone what's happening there." Word for word, it was identical to the 1997 broadcast, but as I listened, I began to notice subtle differences in the background. The hum that had intrigued me on Dad's tape was stronger now, more complex. It sounded like machinery, not electronic equipment, but something mechanical, rhythmic, like the steady beating of enormous gears. "They're not from here, they're from somewhere else. Another dimension, another reality, I don't know. But they're here now, and they've been infiltrating our military installations. They look like us, but they're not us. They're preparing for something." Tom's equipment was going crazy, needles jumping across dials as he tried to triangulate the source of the transmission. "It's directly overhead," he whispered, 2,000 feet up and holding position. I looked up at the star-filled sky but saw nothing. No aircraft lights. No movement against the constellations. The transmission continued. "If anyone's listening, if anyone cares about this country, you need to know they're coming. They've been here for decades, but now they're ready to reveal themselves. The time is coming when they won't hide anymore." The frantic voice began to break up, just as it had in 1997. But instead of cutting to Art Bell's response, the signal faded to static, then silence. Tom and I sat in the darkness for several minutes, neither of us speaking. Finally, he began shutting down his equipment. "Same message," he said quietly. "Word for word, exactly the same as 97. But that's impossible. It's been 28 years. Tom packed his equipment methodically, his movements careful and deliberate. Maybe the message wasn't meant for 1997. Maybe it was meant for now. As we prepared to leave, I made one final check of the building. The radio console that had been humming with activity was now dark, its green lights extinguished. But in the drawer where I'd found the logbooks, there was something new, a single sheet of paper that hadn't been there before. The paper contained a list of coordinates, hundreds of them, scattered across the United States and other countries. Below the coordinates was a date, September 11th, 2026. And at the bottom of the page, in the same shaky handwriting I'd seen on Dad's cassette tape, were 4 words. "The warning is complete." 3 months have passed since that night in the Nevada desert. I've digitized Dad's tape and compared its background hum to the recording I made of the live transmission. The patterns match perfectly. Not similar, not close, but absolutely identical, down to the most minute frequency variations. It's as if the same message has been broadcasting for 28 years, unchanged and unchanging, waiting for the right people to hear it at the right time. I've traced the coordinates from the paper I found in the building. They correspond to military installations, government facilities, and research centres around the world. Some are public knowledge, NORAD, the Pentagon, major Air Force bases. Others are more obscure, locations that don't appear on any official maps but show up in declassified documents and conspiracy theory forums. All of them are scheduled to be revealed according to the paper on September 11th, 2026. Tom and I stay in touch. He's been monitoring radio frequencies around other coordinates on the list, and he's detected similar transmission anomalies at sites across the southwest. Always the same date, always the same time, always the same message. The warning is spreading, broadcasting from more locations each year. The rational part of my mind still insists this is elaborate fiction. A decades-long hoax perpetrated by unknown parties for unknown reasons. But the evidence keeps accumulating, and my father's cassette tape remains the most damning piece of all. Why did he record it? Why did he save it for 28 years with a warning not to play it? And how did he know that someday someone would need to hear not just the famous call, but the part that came after? Art Bell's genuine shock at the sudden satellite failure, his immediate suspicion that someone didn't want the message heard. I've started having dreams about the desert, about standing in that abandoned building and listening to voices that shouldn't exist. In the dreams, the caller's voice is clearer, less frantic. He's trying to tell me something specific, something beyond the general warning about extra-dimensional beings and infiltration. He's trying to tell me that the transmission isn't a warning about something that might happen. It's a countdown to something that will happen, and we have less than a year left. I think about that final night often, about Tom's words as we packed up our equipment under the desert stars. Maybe the message wasn't meant for 1997. Maybe it was meant for now. But I've come to believe something even more unsettling. The message wasn't just meant for now. It was meant to create now. Every person who heard that call, every investigator who followed the trail of clues, every forum post and conspiracy theory it spawned, were all part of something larger, a carefully orchestrated sequence of events designed to bring the right people to the right places at the right time. The caller said they were coming back. He said they'd been preparing for decades, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. September 11th, 2026 is less than 13 months away. Maybe this was the warning, and maybe we missed it the first time because we weren't ready to understand what we were really hearing. But now, 28 years later, with the world balanced on the edge of technological revolution and social upheaval, maybe we're finally ready to listen. My investigation has revealed a truth that's both terrifying and magnificent in its scope. The 1997 call wasn't a cry for help. It was a recruitment message designed to identify and gather people with a curiosity and determination to follow the trail to its conclusion. Every person who heard the call and felt compelled to investigate, every forum post analysing the background hum, every late-night drive to the Nevada desert. It was all planned, orchestrated by intelligence far beyond human comprehension. We weren't discovering the truth. We were being led to it. The evidence is everywhere once you know how to look for it. The forum posts from 1999 that conveniently provided just enough information to keep people searching. The local residents at each site who had decades of documentation ready to share with visitors. The federal authorities who warned people away but never actually prevented them from reaching the sites. Even Tom's appearance at the Nevada installation wasn't coincidence. I've since learned that he received an anonymous tip about unusual activity at the site, timed perfectly to ensure he'd be there when I arrived. We were meant to meet, meant to combine our knowledge and resources to uncover the full scope of the network. The question is, are we ready for what comes next? I've set up my own monitoring equipment now, scanning frequencies around the clock. The annual transmissions are getting stronger, more frequent. What started as a single desperate call in 1997 has become a network of signals broadcasting from locations across the globe. But I've also detected something new in recent weeks. Responses. Other voices, speaking in languages I don't recognise, transmitting from coordinates that don't appear on any of our maps. The network isn't just broadcasting anymore, it's communicating, coordinating, preparing for something massive. The pattern is accelerating. 2 weeks ago, Tom called me with news that confirmed my worst fears. His equipment had detected a massive power surge across the entire southwestern United States, centered on the Nevada installation. The surge lasted exactly 11 minutes, the same duration as the original 1997 call, and occurred at precisely 3:10 a.m. Pacific time. But it wasn't September 11th, it was August 30th, 2 weeks early. The timeline's changing, Tom told me over our encrypted connection. Whatever they've been building toward, it's happening faster than planned. I drove back to Nevada that same night, arriving at the installation just before dawn. The building looked the same from the outside, but inside everything had changed. The old radio console had been replaced with equipment I'd never seen before, sleek, crystalline structures that hummed with barely contained energy. The walls were lined with displays showing data streams in symbols that looked almost hieroglyphic. And standing in the centre of it all was a man I recognised from photographs in Dad's papers. He was older now, greyer, but unmistakably the same person who had signed those letters as J. Mitchell. "You're right on time," he said without turning around. "Your father said you'd figure it out eventually. He was very proud of you, you know." "You knew my father?" Mitchell smiled sadly. "Jim was one of us from the beginning, a member of the group tasked with documenting and preserving evidence of the contact protocol. We've been preparing for this moment for over 30 years. Contact protocol? The systematic introduction of humanity to our partners in this venture," Mitchell explained, gesturing toward the alien equipment surrounding us. "The beings your father's generation called extra-dimensional are actually our ancestors, humanity's future selves, travelling back through time to guide our development and ensure we reach the point where contact becomes possible." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Time travellers? "Think of it as temporal anthropology," Mitchell said. "They've been observing and occasionally intervening in human development for centuries, but always carefully, always gradually." The 1997 broadcast was the beginning of the final phase, the recruitment and preparation of individuals who would help facilitate the open revelation of their presence. He activated one of the displays showing me a timeline spanning decades. The 1997 coast-to-coast call was just one point on a vast map of interventions, UFO sightings, government leaks, conspiracy theories, and media portrayals all carefully orchestrated to gradually prepare humanity for the truth. Every person who heard that call and felt compelled to investigate was selected for specific psychological and intellectual traits, Mitchell continued. Curiosity, persistence, the ability to think outside conventional frameworks. You and hundreds of others like you have been unknowingly preparing for this moment your entire lives. What moment? Mitchell's expression grew grave. September 11th, 2026 was the original timeline for open contact. But global events have accelerated beyond projections. Climate change, technological advancement, social upheaval. Humanity is approaching a critical point earlier than expected. The contact timeline has been moved up. To when? September 11th, 2025, this year, 63 days from now. The weight of the revelation nearly buckled my knees. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you have a choice to make," Mitchell said. "You can walk away now, return to your normal life, and watch the revelation unfold on the news like everyone else. Or you can stay and help us prepare for what's coming. Your father chose to help, but he knew the final decision would be yours." I thought about Dad's cassette tape, his careful preservation of evidence, his lifelong fascination with the unexplained. He'd been part of something incredible, something that would reshape humanity's understanding of its place in the universe. What would I have to do? Mitchell smiled. "Help us wake up the rest of the network. There are monitoring stations like this one all over the world, and each one needs an operator who understands what they're really seeing. People like you, who've followed the trail this far and are ready to take the final step. And somewhere in the static between stations, in the quiet moments when the airwaves fall silent, I swear I can hear machinery humming beneath the earth, enormous gears turning in preparation for something vast and inevitable. The warning is complete," the paper said, "but I don't think the warning was ever meant for us. I think it was meant for them, our future selves, confirming that the timeline was proceeding as planned, that the right people were in the right places at the right time." I accepted Mitchell's offer. Over the past 2 months, I've helped activate 17 monitoring stations across North America. Each station is operated by someone like me, a person who heard the call, followed the clues, and discovered they'd been selected for something extraordinary. We're not just observers anymore, we're participants in the most significant event in human history. The technology is beyond anything our current science can explain. The equipment doesn't just monitor radio transmissions, it monitors temporal fluctuations, tracking the movements of beings who exist partially outside our normal time stream. What we've been calling extra-dimensional is actually extra-temporal, our descendants from a future where humanity has learned to navigate time itself. They've been guiding our development for centuries, nudging us toward the technological and social breakthroughs necessary to join them as partners rather than remaining as subjects of study. The revelation scheduled for September 11th isn't an invasion or conquest. It's a graduation ceremony. Humanity is about to learn that we're not alone in the universe because we never were alone. We've been under the protection and guidance of our own future selves all along. The Coast to Coast call in 1997 was their way of identifying people with the intellectual flexibility and emotional stability to handle this truth. The frantic, terrified voice wasn't warning about an invasion. It was expressing the natural fear and confusion any person from our era would feel upon discovering the reality of time travel and temporal intervention. But the caller wasn't just any person. Analysis of the voice patterns and linguistic markers suggests he was one of us, one of the people recruited through the decades-long selection process, but from an earlier iteration of the timeline. His fear came from understanding what was approaching, not from being threatened by it. September 11th, 2025 is now just 3 weeks away, and the final preparations are accelerating. The monitoring stations have become communication hubs, allowing real-time coordination between the temporal intervention team and their contacts in our era. The conversations I overhear are fascinating and terrifying in equal measure. Discussions of timeline stabilization, cultural adaptation protocols, and the careful choreography required to reveal the truth without causing mass panic. I've learned that the specific date, September 11th, was chosen not for its symbolic significance in our timeline, but because it represents a temporal intersection point where multiple probability streams converge. On that date, at exactly 3:10 a.m. Pacific time, the barriers between our time and theirs will be thin enough to allow for stable, permanent contact. The revelation won't be subtle. Every monitoring station will activate simultaneously, broadcasting a coordinated message that will override radio, television, and internet communications worldwide. The message will come not from mysterious callers or government spokespeople, but from recognizable human faces, our descendants, showing us what humanity becomes when we survive our current challenges and learn to work together on a cosmic scale. The future they represent isn't utopian, but it's hopeful. They've survived climate change, technological disruption, and social upheaval by learning to think beyond the limitations of linear time. They've become gardeners of their own past, nurturing the seeds of wisdom and cooperation that will grow into the civilization they represent. And in 21 days, they're going to offer us the chance to join them. I think about my father often during these final weeks. He spent years preserving that cassette tape, knowing that someday his son would need to hear it and follow the trail to its conclusion. He was part of a generation that laid the groundwork for this moment, and now it's my generation's turn to take the next step. The choice that awaits humanity on September 11th isn't whether to accept or reject contact with alien beings. It's whether we're ready to accept responsibility for becoming the ancestors of a civilization capable of travelling through time to guide its own development. Are we ready to become gardeners of time itself? In 18 days, we'll find out. Welcome to Sleep Theories, where we explore the stories that keep you awake at night. Before we dive into today's tale, I want to thank Galetti Productions for suggesting this chilling narrative. If you have ideas for future stories, please leave them in the comments below. And if you enjoy these dark tales, don't forget to like and subscribe to Sleep Theories for more content that will make you question everything you think you know about our world. What you're about to hear is a first-person account that surfaced on various encrypted forums before mysteriously disappearing. The narrator's identity remains unknown. Some claim it's fiction, others believe it's a warning. You'll have to decide for yourself. My name doesn't matter anymore. What matters is what I found, and what it cost me to share it with the world. 6 months ago, I was just another face in the cubicle farm, a mid-level data analyst working for Meridian Consulting, a contractor that specialised in processing documentation for various United Nations partner agencies. It was boring work, the kind that pays the bills but doesn't exactly inspire water-cooler conversations. My job was simple. Take massive folders of open-source documents related to sustainable development goals and organise them into digestible reports for policymakers. Climate data, poverty statistics, education metrics, all the dry stuff that makes the world go round, theoretically. I'd been doing it for 3 years, long enough to recognise the patterns, long enough to know when something didn't belong. It was a Tuesday morning in March when everything changed. I was working through my usual queue of files when a new folder appeared in my secure inbox. SDG Compliance. Phase 3, Internal Use Only. The timestamp showed it had been uploaded at 3:47 AM, which struck me as odd. Most of our documentation came through during business hours, properly labelled and categorised. I should have flagged it immediately. Protocol dictated that any file marked Internal Use Only should be forwarded to my supervisor without opening. But curiosity killed more than just cats, and I'd always been too curious for my own good. The folder contained 47 documents, most of them PDFs with official UN letterheads. At first glance they looked legitimate: charts, graphs, policy recommendations. But as I scrolled through the first document, something felt wrong. The language was different from the usual bureaucratic speak I was used to processing. Instead of vague references to sustainable urban development, I found detailed maps showing what were labelled as population consolidation zones. Major cities were divided into coloured sections. Green zones marked compliant residential areas, yellow zones labelled transition monitoring required, and red zones ominously tagged relocation priority. My hands trembled as I opened the second document. It was a spreadsheet titled Behavioural Compliance Credits, Phase 3 Implementation. Each row represented a different category of human activity: private vehicle ownership, meat consumption, energy usage, travel frequency. Next to each category were point values, negative numbers that would be deducted from something called a citizenship score. The third document made my stomach drop. It was a timeline, meticulously planned and colour-coded, with one phrase repeated at the top of every page: Target year 2030. The timeline started in 2025 with Phase 1, Infrastructure Digitization. Banking systems, identification cards, payment processing, everything would be converted to digital platforms with mandatory government oversight. Phase 2, scheduled for 2027, was labelled Voluntary Compliance Incentivization. Tax breaks and social benefits would be tied to behaviour modification programs. But Phase 3, set for 2029, sent chills down my spine. Mandatory compliance enforcement. Citizens who failed to meet behavioural standards would lose access to housing subsidies, food distribution networks, and healthcare services. The document coldly referred to this as natural selection through administrative channels. I found myself reading the same sentences over and over, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. This couldn't be real. The United Nations was supposed to be about humanitarian aid and international cooperation, not population control and behavioural manipulation. But the documents were too detailed, too specific to be fake. They referenced real programs I'd seen in previous reports. Smart city initiatives in Toronto, digital identity pilots in Amsterdam, carbon credit systems being tested in Singapore. All of it was presented as voluntary, progressive and environmentally conscious, but according to these files, it was all preparation for something much darker. The final document in the folder was a memo dated just 2 weeks earlier. It was addressed to regional coordination directors and signed by someone with the title Under Secretary for Compliance Architecture. The subject line read, Accelerated Timeline Approval, Operation Sustainable Transition. Colleagues, it began, recent global events have provided us with an unprecedented opportunity to advance our timeline. Public acceptance of monitoring and restriction measures has exceeded projections by 340%. We are therefore moving to implement Phase 3 protocols 18 months ahead of schedule. All regional coordinators should prepare their populations for the transition to mandatory compliance by Q4 2029. Remember, this is not about control, it is about survival. The planet cannot sustain current consumption patterns. We are the shepherds of a new era. I sat back in my chair, staring at the screen. The cursor blinked in the search bar, waiting for my next move. Around me, my colleagues continued their work, oblivious to what I'd stumbled across. The hum of fluorescent lights seemed suddenly oppressive, the click of keyboards ominous. I glanced at the clock. 11:23 a.m. In a few hours I'd have to log this file in our system, noting what I'd reviewed and any relevant findings. But what exactly had I found? Evidence of the most elaborate conspiracy in human history, or the fevered imagination of someone with too much time and access to official letterhead templates? My supervisor, Janet Morrison, walked past my cubicle, coffee mug in hand. She smiled and nodded, the same greeting she'd given me every day for 3 years. Should I tell her what I'd found? Should I forward the files and let someone else make the decision? Instead, I did something that would change my life forever. I opened a new email and began typing. Janet, I've received a file folder that appears to be outside my clearance level. The documents reference programs and timelines that I believe require senior review. Should I forward this to you, or is there a specific protocol for handling classified materials that I'm not aware of? Please advise. Mark. I read the email 3 times before hitting send. It was professional, cautious, and documented my discovery without making accusations. If this was all legitimate, I'd followed proper channels. If it wasn't, well, at least I'd have a paper trail showing I'd tried to do the right thing. The email showed as delivered at 11:31 a.m. I saved the documents to a secure folder on my desktop and logged out for lunch, trying to act normal despite the growing knot in my stomach. When I returned from my sandwich and a walk around the block, Janet hadn't responded to my email. That wasn't unusual. She often got caught up in meetings and didn't check messages until late afternoon. But as the day wore on and 5 p.m. approached, I began to worry. At 5:47 p.m, my computer chimed with a new message. But it wasn't from Janet. It was an automated system notification. File access revoked. Classification updated to restricted. Contact administrator for additional information. When I tried to open the folder containing the documents, I got an error message. Access denied. Insufficient privileges. I sat there for a long moment staring at the screen. Then I packed up my things, said goodnight to the security guard, and drove home with one thought echoing in my head. What the hell had I just gotten myself into? That night, I barely slept. Every car that drove past my apartment seemed to slow down. Every creak of the building settling made me jump. I kept telling myself I was being paranoid, that I'd simply stumbled across some routine planning documents that were above my pay grade. But deep down, I knew I'd seen something I wasn't supposed to see, and someone somewhere now knew that I'd seen it. I arrived at work the next morning 15 minutes early, hoping to catch Janet before the day got busy. Her office was dark, which wasn't unusual. She typically arrived around 9 a.m, preferring to avoid rush hour traffic. I settled into my cubicle and tried to focus on routine tasks while waiting for her response to my email. At 9:30, Janet still hadn't arrived. Her assistant, Maria, seemed unconcerned when I asked about her whereabouts. She had an early meeting downtown, Maria said, without looking up from her computer. Something about a new contract. She'll probably be in after lunch. But Janet never showed up that day, or the next. By Thursday, Maria was fielding calls from confused clients and increasingly worried family members. Family emergency, she kept saying, but her voice lacked conviction. She'll be back early next week. That's when I noticed my computer had been acting strangely. Programs were loading slower than usual, and several files I'd been working on had vanished from my desktop. When I tried to access my email archives, I discovered that my entire inbox from the previous week had been deleted, including my message to Janet. The IT department claimed it was a routine system update that had caused some data loss, but they couldn't explain why only certain files were affected, or why the deletions seemed to target specific date ranges. "These things happen," the technician said with a shrug. "That's why we tell everyone to back up important files." But I hadn't lost everything. Hidden in a rarely used folder buried deep in my directory structure, I found fragments of the documents I'd viewed. Not the complete files, but screenshots I'd taken without realizing it when my screen capture software had malfunctioned the day I first opened the folder. The images were partial and pixelated, but they showed enough to confirm that I hadn't imagined it all. Population consolidation zones, behavioural compliance credits, the 2030 target date. I was studying these fragments when my cubicle neighbour, Tom Rivera, leaned over the partition that separated our workstations. Tom was a junior analyst who'd started 6 months after me. We'd shared coffee breaks and complained about deadline pressures, but we weren't particularly close. "Hey," he whispered, glancing around nervously. "Can I ask you something weird?" I minimised my screen and nodded. "Did you happen to see anything strange in your files last week? Like documents that seemed out of place?" The question sent a chill through me. "What kind of document?" Tom looked around again, then rolled his chair closer. "I got this folder by mistake, I think. Had all these maps and charts about moving people around, controlling where they could live and work. Really creepy stuff." "What did you do with it?" "Forwarded it to my supervisor, just like protocol says. But then," he paused, lowering his voice even further. "Then my supervisor disappeared, just like Janet. And this morning, my computer was completely wiped. Like everything. They gave me some story about a virus, but I know that's not what happened." We stared at each other for a moment, both understanding that we'd stumbled into something much larger than either of us had realised. "Listen," Tom continued, "I printed out a few pages before I forwarded the files. You know, just in case my supervisor had questions about the content. I still have them at home. Tom, if what we saw is real, then we're probably in serious trouble just for talking about it." He glanced at the empty supervisor offices. "Look, I'm getting scared. First the files, then the disappearances, now the data wipes. Someone really doesn't want us to know what we saw. I made a decision that would haunt me for months. Meet me for coffee after work. The place on 5th Street, across from the library. We need to figure out what's going on." The rest of the day crawled by. I couldn't concentrate on my assigned tasks, constantly checking over my shoulder and jumping every time someone walked past my cubicle. At lunch, I took a walk to the local print shop and made copies of the screenshot fragments I'd found, storing the originals in a safety deposit box I'd opened on impulse. When 5 p.m. finally arrived, I packed up quickly and headed for the coffee shop. Tom was already there, sitting in a corner booth with his back to the wall. He looked like he hadn't slept much. "This is crazy," he said as I sat down. "I keep thinking we should just drop it, pretend we never saw anything. But we did see it, and people are disappearing." Tom nodded grimly and slid a manila folder across the table. "I printed these Tuesday night before everything went to hell." The folder contained 8 pages of documents similar to what I'd seen. Maps of major cities divided into coloured zones, a budget allocation chart for something called voluntary relocation assistance programs. Most disturbing was a page titled Resistance Mitigation Strategies that outlined plans for dealing with what it called non-compliant population segments. "Look at the dates," Tom said, pointing to timestamps in the corner of each page. "These were created last month, but they reference events scheduled for next year. It's like they're planning everything in advance." "Planning what exactly?" Tom pulled out his phone and opened a news app. "I've been researching all day. Look at this." He showed me article after article about new government initiatives, mandatory digital health passes, carbon credit systems tied to personal banking accounts, smart city infrastructure projects that included extensive surveillance networks. Every single one of these programs is mentioned in the documents we saw, he said, but in the news, they're presented as separate voluntary initiatives for public safety and environmental protection. Nobody's talking about how they all connect. I thought about the timeline I'd seen, the careful progression from voluntary compliance to mandatory enforcement. What if they're not separate initiatives? What if it's all part of a larger plan? Tom's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and went pale. What is it? Text from an unknown number. He showed me the message. Stop digging or join your supervisors. We sat in stunned silence for a moment. Then Tom stood up abruptly. I'm done. This is too dangerous. Tom, wait. No, I should never have gotten involved. I'm going home, and tomorrow I'm requesting a transfer to a different department. I suggest you do the same. He left the folder on the table and walked out, leaving me alone with documents that could either be the ravings of a conspiracy theorist or evidence of the largest social engineering project in human history. I walked home through streets that suddenly seemed full of cameras and sensors, wondering if I was being watched, if every step was being recorded and analysed by systems I was only beginning to understand. When I got to my apartment, I found a note taped to my door. Package delivered to management office. But I hadn't ordered anything, and when I checked with the building manager, there was no package waiting for me. The note was dated that morning, written in handwriting I didn't recognise. That night, I made another impulsive decision. I drove to an internet cafe on the other side of town and used a public computer to create anonymous email accounts on several platforms. Then I uploaded the documents Tom had given me, along with my screenshot fragments, to multiple cloud storage services. If something happened to me, at least there would be a record. But as I drove home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was already too late, that I'd been marked from the moment I opened that first folder. In my rearview mirror, I noticed the same dark sedan that had been behind me when I left the coffee shop. It followed me all the way home. Sleep became a luxury I couldn't afford. Every sound in the hallway outside my apartment sent me to the window, peering through blinds at empty streets that somehow felt full of hidden watchers. Tom didn't show up for work the next day, or the day after that. His desk was cleared out by the weekend, and when I asked Maria about it, she said he'd requested an immediate transfer to pursue other opportunities. But I knew better. Tom had been scared, and scared people in our situation didn't get transfers, they got disappeared. With Janet gone and Tom relocated to who knows where, I was left alone with fragments of documents that painted a picture too terrifying to ignore and too dangerous to pursue. But I had to know more. If this was real, if there truly was a coordinated plan to reshape society by 2030, then someone needed to document it. I began my research carefully, using the public library's computers and paying cash for internet access at various cafes around the city. I created a simple methodology, cross-referenced the terms and programs mentioned in the leaked documents with publicly available information, looking for patterns and connections that might confirm or refute what I'd seen. The results were more disturbing than I'd expected. Smart city gateways was mentioned in 17 different documents I'd glimpsed. A quick search revealed that Toronto had announced a partnership with a tech consortium to implement exactly such a system by 2026. The project would integrate biometric identification, real-time location tracking, and automated behavioural assessment into a single platform designed to optimise urban resource distribution. The public announcement described it as a voluntary program to help residents access services more efficiently. But buried in the technical specifications, I found references to compliance monitoring algorithms and automated privilege adjustment protocols. Amsterdam's digital citizenship pilot was even more explicit. Citizens who participated would receive carbon credits for demonstrating environmentally conscious behaviour, measured through smartphone tracking, purchase monitoring, and periodic check-ins at verification stations throughout the city. The credits could be used for transportation discounts, housing assistance, and priority access to healthcare. But what happened to citizens who didn't participate, or who failed to meet behavioural targets? The program documentation was vague about consequences, mentioning only alternative pathways for non-participating residents. Singapore's implementation was the most advanced. Their sustainable living credit system had been operational for 8 months, and earlier reports claimed impressive results: 67% reduction in private vehicle usage, 45% decrease in meat consumption, and 89% compliance with residential energy limitations. I found a blog post from a Singapore resident that painted a different picture. The author, writing under an obvious pseudonym, described a society where every purchase, every journey, every social interaction was monitored and scored. Citizens who failed to maintain adequate sustainability ratings found themselves locked out of public transportation, unable to access certain stores, and restricted to specific residential areas. It started as incentives, the blogger wrote: green points for taking the bus, bonus credits for eating plant-based meals, rewards for staying in your assigned district. But the incentives became requirements so gradually that most people didn't notice the transition. Now, if your score drops too low, you simply can't function in society, and raising your score requires complete submission to the system's behavioural demands. The post had been published 3 weeks ago. When I tried to access it again the next day, the entire blog had been removed. I began compiling a spreadsheet of every program, initiative, and policy mentioned in the leaked documents, then researching whether similar real-world implementations existed. The results were consistent and terrifying. Every single item had a corresponding program either already active or scheduled for implementation within the next 2 years. Carbon credit systems tied to personal banking accounts, announced by the European Central Bank for rollout in 2026. Biometric checkpoints for access to essential services, pilot programs active in 12 major cities worldwide. Residential assignment based on compliance scores, being tested in 3 countries under the guise of efficient housing allocation. Digital identity requirements for all online activities. Legislation pending in multiple jurisdictions to combat misinformation and ensure digital safety. The pattern was unmistakable. What appeared to be separate, well-intentioned programs were actually components of a comprehensive system designed to monitor, control, and modify human behaviour on a global scale, and they were all scheduled to reach full implementation by 2030. But the most chilling discovery came when I researched the organisational structure behind these initiatives. Many of the programs were funded through the same consortium of international organisations, tech companies, and government agencies. The same names appeared on advisory boards and implementation committees across different countries and continents. One name appeared particularly frequently: the Sustainable Future Institute, a think tank founded in 2019 with substantial backing from several major philanthropic foundations. Their published research covered everything from climate change mitigation to urban planning optimization. All of it sounded reasonable and beneficial, but when I dug deeper, I found connections to government contracts for surveillance technology, behavioural modification research, and something called population management systems architecture. The Institute's founder, a former UN administrator named Dr. Catherine Voss, had given speeches advocating for necessary sacrifices in individual autonomy to ensure species survival. In a 2023 interview she'd said, "Democracy and freedom are luxuries we can no longer afford. The climate crisis requires coordinated action on a scale that voluntary compliance cannot achieve. We must be willing to accept temporary limitations on personal choice in service of permanent solutions to existential threats." Temporary limitations? I wondered if the people implementing these systems really believed they would be temporary, or if they knew exactly what they were building. A global cage disguised as environmental salvation. As weeks passed, my research expanded beyond simple correlation. I began mapping the financial relationships between organisations, tracking personnel movements between government agencies and private companies, documenting the timeline of policy implementations across different countries. What emerged was a picture of unprecedented coordination. The same small group of organisations was driving policy changes on every continent, using local governments as implementation vehicles for a globally designed system. But I was still missing crucial pieces of the puzzle. The documents Tom and I had seen referenced enforcement mechanisms that went beyond social credit scores and access restrictions. They mentioned relocation programs, resource rationing, and something ominously called population optimization protocols. I needed more information, but I was running out of safe ways to obtain it. My library research had attracted attention. I'd noticed the same security guard watching me during several visits, and the librarian had started asking unusual questions about my research topics. It was during one of these library sessions that everything changed. I was printing articles about digital identity legislation when someone approached my table. A woman in her 50s, professionally dressed, with a kind of composed demeanour that suggested either corporate management or government service. "Excuse me," she said quietly, "but I couldn't help noticing your research interests. Would you be interested in information that might fill in some gaps?" Every instinct screamed at me to pack up and leave, but she held up a folder that looked remarkably similar to the ones Tom and I had found. "My name is Elena Rodriguez," she said, sitting down without invitation. "Until 6 months ago, I was a sustainability coordinator for the United Nations Development Programme, and I think we need to talk." Elena insisted we meet somewhere more private. She suggested a small cafe in the Arts District, the kind of place that played acoustic music loud enough to mask conversation, and served coffee in mismatched cups to customers who minded their own business. I arrived first, choosing a table in the back corner where we could see both the entrance and the emergency exit. Elena appeared exactly on time, carrying a worn leather briefcase and wearing the expression of someone who'd made a decision that couldn't be undone. "Before we begin," she said, settling into the chair across from me, "I need you to understand something. What I'm about to share will put both of us in danger. Once you know this information, there's no going back to ignorance, no pretending you never heard it." I nodded, though part of me wanted to walk away. The smart thing would have been to thank her politely and leave, to find a new job in a different field and spend the rest of my life pretending I'd never seen those documents. But I stayed. Elena opened her briefcase and removed a thick folder. "You've been researching the sustainability initiatives, the smart city programs, the digital identity requirements. You're trying to understand how they all connect. How do you know what I've been researching?" "Because I helped design the connection points." She opened the folder and spread several documents across the table. "I spent 4 years working on what we called the Integrated Sustainability Platform. My job was to ensure that all the separate programs could interface with each other, share data, and coordinate responses." The documents she showed me were similar to what I'd seen before, but far more detailed. Organisational charts that mapped relationships between dozens of agencies and corporations, technical specifications for data sharing protocols, implementation timelines that showed how voluntary programs would transition to mandatory compliance. "The public face of Agenda 2030 is real," Elena continued. "The Sustainable Development Goals, the climate initiatives, the poverty reduction programs, all of that is genuine and necessary. But there's another layer, a coordinated system that uses these worthy goals as justification for unprecedented social control." She pointed to a document labelled Phase Architecture Overview. It showed 3 distinct implementation stages, exactly matching what I'd seen in the leaked files. Phase 1 focused on infrastructure development. Get people comfortable with digital systems. Establish the technical framework for monitoring and control. Most of this phase is already complete. Phase 2 was incentivization. Make compliance attractive through benefits and rewards while gradually increasing the social and economic costs of non-participation. We're in the middle of this phase now. Elena's voice dropped to a whisper. Phase 3 is enforcement. By 2030, the system becomes mandatory. Citizens who don't comply lose access to banking, healthcare, housing assistance, and employment. It's designed to make non-compliance practically impossible. I studied the documents, trying to process the implications, but surely people would resist. There would be protests, political opposition. That's been planned for 2. Elena flipped to a section titled Public Acceptance Strategies. It outlined a comprehensive approach to managing public opinion through media partnerships, social media manipulation, and strategic crisis deployment. Every potential objection has been anticipated and countered, she said. Privacy concerns are dismissed as selfish in the face of climate emergency. Economic fears are addressed through promises of universal basic income tied to compliance. Religious or cultural objections are characterized as dangerous extremism. She showed me polling data that tracked public acceptance of various control measures over time. The numbers were sobering. Support for digital identity requirements had grown from 23% to 67% in just 2 years, driven by concerns about online security and misinformation. Acceptance of carbon credit systems had increased even more dramatically after several high-profile climate disasters. People want to do the right thing, Elena said. They want to help save the planet and protect their communities. The system exploits that desire, channeling genuine concern into acceptance of comprehensive control. If this is all true, why did you leave? And why are you talking to me? Elena was quiet for a long moment, staring into her coffee cup. I left because I realised what we were really building. I told myself for years that we were creating tools to address genuine crises, that temporary restrictions on freedom were justified by the urgent need for coordinated action. But the restrictions were never meant to be temporary, were they? The people at the top, the ones making the real decisions, they genuinely believe that democracy and individual liberty are obstacles to human survival. They see free choice as a luxury we can't afford, personal autonomy as a threat to species-level coordination. She opened another section of the folder, revealing documents that made my stomach turn. Plans for optimal population distribution that involved moving millions of people from rural areas into monitored urban zones. Resource allocation models that determined individual caloric allowances based on productivity scores. Educational restructuring programs designed to align personal goals with collective necessities. This isn't just about environmental protection, Elena continued. It's about fundamentally restructuring human society. The climate crisis provided the justification, but the real goal is creating what they call sustainable civilization, a managed society where every aspect of human behaviour is optimised for collective outcomes. And everyone just goes along with it. Most people never see the whole picture. They only interact with their small piece of the system. Their local digital ID program, their neighbourhood carbon credit initiative, their workplace compliance monitoring. Each component seems reasonable in isolation. Elena showed me internal communications between program coordinators in different countries. The language was bureaucratic and sanitised, but the content was chilling. Updates on resistance containment strategies, reports on compliance acceleration techniques, and budget requests for population management infrastructure. The coordinators don't communicate directly about control or oppression, she explained. They use euphemisms like behavioural optimization and resource management efficiency. Most of them probably believe they're working on humanitarian projects, but you knew better. I figured it out gradually as I gained access to higher-level planning documents. By the time I understood what we were really building, I was already deeply involved. Leaving wasn't easy. They don't let people with my level of knowledge simply resign. She glanced around the cafe nervously. I've been in hiding for 6 months, moving between safe houses, trying to gather evidence that could expose the true scope of the program. Why haven't you gone to the media? Elena laughed bitterly. With what? Documents that can be dismissed as forgeries, claims that sound like conspiracy theories. The system is too large and too coordinated for traditional journalism to expose. By the time reporters could verify the connections and compile comprehensive evidence, the implementation would be complete. Then what's the solution? Documentation, preservation. We need to create a record that can't be suppressed or discredited. When people finally realise what's happened, they'll need proof that it was planned, that it wasn't just a series of unfortunate coincidences or well-intentioned policies gone wrong. Elena closed the folder and leaned back in her chair. That's why I approached you. Your research shows that you understand the connections, and you're not in a position where disappearing, you would draw unwanted attention. The casual way she mentioned my potential disappearance sent chills through me. What exactly are you asking me to do? Help me compile a comprehensive archive of evidence. Documents, communications, financial records, implementation timelines. Everything we can gather to prove that this was a coordinated plan rather than organic policy development. And then what? Then we find a way to preserve that archive until people are ready to see the truth. Elena stood up, leaving the folder on the table. Think about it. But don't take too long. The implementation is accelerating and opportunities to document it are disappearing. She walked away, leaving me alone with documents that confirmed my worst fears about the scope and coordination of what I'd discovered. As I packed the folder into my bag, I noticed that my hands were shaking. Outside the cafe, I looked for Elena, but she had already vanished into the crowd. I walked home through streets that seemed different now. Every camera and sensor a component of something larger and more threatening than I'd previously imagined. That night I read through Elena's documents 3 times, cross-referencing them with my own research. The evidence was overwhelming and terrifying, but it was also incomplete. We had proof of coordination and planning, but not enough to convince a skeptical public or overcome the sophisticated manipulation strategies the system employed. I made my decision while sitting in my apartment at 2 a.m, surrounded by papers that documented the systematic dismantling of human freedom in the name of planetary salvation. I was going to help Elena build her archive, whatever the cost, because if we didn't preserve the truth, there might not be anyone left who remembered what freedom had looked like. Elena and I established a communication protocol using encrypted messaging apps and anonymous email accounts. We met weekly at different locations, libraries, parks, shopping centres, never the same place twice. She provided documents and insider knowledge. I contributed research skills and a growing network of contacts who were beginning to ask uncomfortable questions about the sustainability programs. For 3 weeks, our collaboration produced results. We mapped the financial relationships between implementing organisations, documented the timeline of policy rollouts, and identified key personnel who moved between government agencies and private contractors. The archive grew to include hundreds of pages of evidence showing coordination that extended far beyond what any legitimate policy initiative would require. But our success made us careless. Elena was supposed to meet me at a downtown park on a Thursday evening. When she didn't show up after 30 minutes, I assumed she'd been delayed or forced to cancel for security reasons. But when I got home, I found an encrypted message waiting. They know, burning everything. Stay safe. That was the last communication I received from her. The next morning I tried calling the phone number she'd given me, but it went straight to a disconnected signal. Her backup email address returned an error message indicating the account had been terminated. It was as if Elena Rodriguez had never existed, but someone knew she had existed, and someone knew we'd been working together. I returned home from work that Friday to find my apartment door standing slightly ajar. Not wide open, just enough that I could tell it had been disturbed. The lock showed no signs of damage, which meant whoever had entered either had keys or possessed sophisticated lockpicking skills. Nothing obvious was missing. My television, computer equipment and jewellery were all exactly where I'd left them, but my laptop was gone, along with the portable drive where I'd been backing up our research. More disturbing, the folder Elena had given me was missing from the hiding place where I'd secured it. They'd taken only what they came for, leaving everything else untouched to maintain the illusion that nothing had happened. A professional job designed to look like nothing more than a minor break-in where the intruders had been scared away before taking anything valuable, but I knew better. I packed a bag with essentials and checked into a motel across town, paying cash and using a false name. From the safety of that anonymous room, I tried to assess the situation. Elena was gone, possibly dead. Our research had been compromised, and whoever was responsible for the break-in now knew that I'd seen evidence of their coordination. The smart thing to do would have been to run. Leave town, find a new job somewhere far away, and hope they'd consider me neutralised without taking more direct action. But I couldn't shake the feeling that running would only delay the inevitable. If Elena had been right about the scope and timeline of the implementation, then there would be nowhere to run. By 2030, the system would be global, and geographic escape would be impossible. The only real safety lay in exposure and resistance. But first, I needed to retrieve the backup files I'd hidden at the bank. I waited until Monday morning, then took a deliberately circuitous route to the safety deposit box location, watching for signs of surveillance. The street seemed normal, but I'd learned not to trust appearances. 3 different times I noticed the same dark sedan in my peripheral vision, always maintaining distance, never close enough to be obviously tailing me. The safety deposit box contained everything Elena and I had compiled, plus additional materials I'd gathered independently. Financial records, organisational charts, communications intercepts, and technical specifications for systems that hadn't been publicly announced. Enough evidence to prove coordination, but presented in a way that could easily be dismissed as coincidence by anyone not already convinced of the conspiracy. I was photocopying key documents when I noticed increased activity in the bank lobby. More security guards than usual, and customers who seemed more interested in watching the clientele than conducting banking business. The manager kept glancing in my direction with an expression that suggested he was expecting something to happen. I finished copying the most critical documents and returned the originals to the safety deposit box, but I could feel the walls closing in. As I walked toward the exit, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Exit through the rear service corridor. You have approximately 90 seconds. Elena. Somehow she was still alive and watching. I followed the instructions, slipping through a maintenance door that led to an alley behind the bank. A motorcycle was waiting, engine running, with a helmet hanging from the handlebars. No rider in sight, just another anonymous message taped to the fuel tank. Take Highway 9 north. Abandon bike at mile marker 47. Continue on foot. I'd never ridden a motorcycle before, but desperation made for a quick learning curve. The bike lurched and stalled twice before I managed to get it moving, but soon I was weaving through traffic toward the highway, my bag of copied documents secured under my jacket. In the rearview mirror I watched the dark sedan emerge from the bank parking lot, followed by two more vehicles that had materialised from side streets. They maintained professional distance, but their coordination was obvious to anyone who knew what to look for. Highway 9 wound through rural farmland before entering forested hills. I pushed the motorcycle faster than was safe, taking curves at speeds that made the bike lean dangerously. But my pursuers had more powerful vehicles, and the gap between us was slowly closing. Mile marker 47 appeared just as the first sedan was close enough that I could see the driver's face in my mirror. I pulled off the road into a dense stand of trees, abandoned the bike as instructed, and plunged into the forest carrying my bag and hoping that Elena's plan included more than just continue on foot. The woods were thick enough to provide cover, but I could hear car doors slamming behind me and the voices coordinating a search. These weren't local police or federal agents conducting a routine investigation. The communication I overheard was too professional, too military in its efficiency. I'd been hiking for 20 minutes when I heard the helicopter. The aircraft appeared through the canopy overhead, flying in a search pattern with what looked like thermal imaging equipment. I pressed myself against the largest tree I could find and tried to remain motionless, but the helicopter circled back twice, its searchlight probing the forest floor. That's when I realised how far beyond normal law enforcement this had escalated. Whatever Elena and I had discovered, it was important enough to justify significant resources and risk considerable exposure. They weren't just trying to silence us. They were treating us as threats to something vital enough to deploy military-grade assets. The helicopter moved on, but I could hear searchers working their way through the trees, calling out grid coordinates and maintaining radio contact with their command structure. I needed to find better shelter, and I needed to get my evidence to someone who could use it. I was stumbling through undergrowth, trying to put distance between myself and the search teams, when I nearly walked into the woman standing behind a massive oak tree. Elena looked different. Thinner, older, with the kind of exhaustion that comes from months of running and hiding. But she was alive, and she gestured for silence while we listened to the search teams passing nearby. When the voices faded, she spoke in whispers. They raided my safe house 3 days ago, killed my contact and burned everything we hadn't already moved. She studied my face in the dim forest light. How much did you manage to save? I showed her the bag of documents. Copies of everything we compiled, plus some additional material I gathered independently. It's not enough, she said. Not nearly enough to convince anyone who isn't already looking for the truth. We need something undeniable, something that can't be dismissed or discredited. What do you have in mind? Elena pulled out a small device that looked like a modified smartphone. I still have access to some internal systems. My credentials haven't been revoked yet, probably because they don't want to create obvious evidence of a security breach, but it's only a matter of time. Access to what? Planning databases, communication archives, financial tracking systems. She activated the device, and its screen showed a complex interface with multiple security layers. If we can get to a hardwired connection point, I can download comprehensive proof of the coordination and planning. Where do we find a connection point? There's a data center about 15 miles from here. Meridian Consulting has server space there for their government contracts. If your employee credentials are still active, we might be able to get inside. The idea was insane. We were being hunted by people with helicopters and thermal imaging equipment, and Elena wanted to break into a secure facility to steal classified data. But looking at the determination in her eyes, I realized she was right. Half measures wouldn't be enough. We needed proof so comprehensive and undeniable that even the sophisticated manipulation strategies couldn't discredit it. How do we get there without being caught? Elena smiled grimly. Very carefully. We spent the next 6 hours moving through the forest, avoiding search teams and aircraft while Elena used her modified device to monitor pursuit communications. The searchers were thorough and well equipped, but they were operating under constraints that limited their effectiveness. Too much visible activity would draw unwanted attention from local authorities and media. By dawn, we'd reached the edge of the forest near a rural highway. Elena had been tracking traffic through surveillance networks, identifying patterns and gaps that would allow us to move without being detected. A delivery truck was scheduled to stop at a convenience store 2 miles from the data center, providing cover for our final approach. Once we're inside the facility, we'll have maybe 30 minutes before someone notices the unauthorized access, Elena said, as we waited for the truck to arrive. I'll need that long to penetrate the security layers and download everything we can carry. And if we're caught? Then people who ask questions about sustainability programs will know what happened to us. The truck arrived on schedule, and we managed to slip into the cargo area during the driver's restroom break. 20 minutes later, we were hiding behind a dumpster outside the data center, watching security guards patrol the perimeter. Elena studied the building through small binoculars. 3 guards, standard rotation every hour, camera coverage on all entrances, but there's a maintenance access point on the north side that's in a blind spot for about 40 seconds during shift changes. What about internal security? Biometric locks, access card readers, motion sensors. But your employee card should get us through the first 2 barriers, and I can handle the electronic systems once we're inside. We waited for the next guard rotation, then sprinted across an open parking area to the maintenance door. Elena connected her device to the lock mechanism while I watched for patrols. The lock clicked open just as footsteps echoed from around the corner. Inside, the data center hummed with the sound of thousands of servers processing information for dozens of government agencies and private contractors. Elena led me through corridors lined with racks of equipment, navigating by memory and occasionally checking her device for layout updates. There, she whispered, pointing to a terminal station surrounded by screens displaying network activity. That's our access point. Elena's fingers flew across the keyboard, entering commands and passwords that bypassed security protocols I didn't understand. Screens filled with data streams, file directories, and communication logs that painted a picture of coordination so vast and detailed that even our previous research had barely scratched the surface. This is incredible, Elena breathed, watching terabytes of information flow past. Financial transactions between organizations on 6 continents. Personnel transfers coordinated across dozens of agencies. Technical specifications for systems that won't be announced for another year. She inserted a high-capacity storage device and began downloading everything she could access. File after file of evidence that proved beyond any doubt that the sustainability programs were components of a carefully orchestrated plan to restructure human society. But our time was running out. Alarms began sounding in distant parts of the building, and Elena's device showed security alerts cascading through the network. They know we're here, she said, still typing furiously. Another few minutes and I'll have everything. That's when the lights went out, and emergency lighting bathed the server room in the red illumination. Through the corridors I could hear doors slamming and radio chatter as security teams converged on our location. Elena yanked the storage device from the terminal. "That's all we're getting. Time to go." But as we turned toward the exit, figures in tactical gear emerged from both ends of the corridor, weapons drawn and voices shouting commands to surrender. We were trapped. The tactical team that surrounded us moved with military precision, but they weren't wearing any identifying insignia or badges. No agency names, no unit designations, just black uniforms and professional equipment operated by people who clearly weren't local law enforcement. "Device on the ground," the team leader commanded. "Hands visible." Elena hesitated, clutching the storage drive that contained terabytes of incriminating evidence. For a moment I thought she might try to destroy it rather than let them recover the data. But faced with multiple weapons, she complied, setting the device on the floor and raising her hands. "We're not terrorists," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We're researchers investigating—" Silence. The team leader approached Elena, studying her face with recognition. "Former Undersecretary Rodriguez. You've been difficult to locate." I imagine I have been. One of the tactical officers collected the storage device while others secured our hands with plastic restraints. They were efficient and professional, but there was something unsettling about their behaviour. No reading of rights, no identification of their authority, no explanation of charges or procedures. "What happens now?" I asked. The team leader ignored my question, speaking into a throat microphone in a language I didn't recognise. The response seemed to satisfy him, because he nodded to his team and gestured toward the exit. They marched us through the data centre to a loading dock where 2 black vehicles waited. As they prepared to separate us into different cars, Elena caught my eye and mouthed a single word. "Remember." That was the last time I saw her. My captors drove for several hours through rural areas I didn't recognise, eventually arriving at what looked like a corporate retreat centre, surrounded by high fences and discreet security measures. They escorted me to a comfortable room that might have been a hotel suite if not for the reinforced door and lack of windows. For 3 days, no one spoke to me. Food appeared through a slot in the door and I was allowed supervised access to bathroom facilities, but my guards remained silent despite my attempts at conversation. I began to wonder if they were planning to hold me indefinitely, or if something worse was being prepared. On the 4th day, a woman in a business suit entered my room carrying a laptop computer and a stack of documents. "I'm Director Sarah Chen," she said, settling into the room's single chair. "I believe you have some questions about recent events." "Where's Elena?" "Former Undersecretary Rodriguez is being debriefed at another facility. Her cooperation will determine her future treatment." Director Chen opened her laptop and showed me surveillance footage of Elena and myself at various locations over the past weeks. The coverage was comprehensive, clearly demonstrating that our activities had been monitored far more closely than we'd realised. "We know about your collaboration, your research, and your infiltration of the data centre," she continued. "What we need to understand is the extent of your knowledge and the scope of your documentation. I want to speak with a lawyer. You're not under arrest, and this isn't a criminal proceeding. Consider this a national security consultation." Chen showed me financial records proving that Meridian Consulting received substantial funding from the same organisations Elena and I had been investigating. My own employer was part of the network we'd been trying to expose. "Your research was quite thorough," she admitted. "Impressively so, given your limited access to classified information. But you've misunderstood the nature and purpose of the coordination you discovered." "Have I?" "The programs you've documented represent humanity's best hope for addressing multiple existential crises simultaneously. Climate change, resource depletion, population pressures, technological disruption, all of these threaten our species' survival. Coordinated response isn't conspiracy, it's necessity." Chen pulled up charts and projections that painted a dire picture of humanity's future without intervention. Environmental collapse within decades, resource wars that would kill billions, social breakdown that would destroy civilization itself. "The coordination you've discovered exists because voluntary compliance with necessary changes has proven insufficient," she explained. "Democracy and individual choice are luxuries that become dangerous when the stakes involve species survival." "So you're admitting that the programs are designed to control people?" I'm explaining that some degree of behavioural management is essential for ensuring that enough humans survive the coming crises to maintain technological civilization. Chen's tone was matter-of-fact, as if she were discussing weather forecasts rather than the systematic elimination of human freedom. And who decides what constitutes necessary control? People with access to comprehensive data and the responsibility for long-term outcomes. Scientists, policy analysts, systems engineers, experts who understand the complexity of the challenges we face. Chen showed me additional documents that detailed the decision-making processes behind the sustainability programs. Groups of highly credentialed professionals making choices based on computer models that calculated optimal outcomes for human survival and environmental stability. Every restriction, every monitoring system, every behavioural modification protocol has been designed to maximise the probability that technological civilization will persist through the crisis period, she said. Personal freedom is irrelevant if there's no surviving society to exercise that freedom within. But what if people don't want to be saved at the cost of their autonomy? Then they'll be saved anyway because the alternative is extinction. Chen closed her laptop and studied my face. You have a choice, Marcus. You can accept that the coordination you've discovered serves a necessary purpose, or you can be classified as a threat to species survival. What does that classification entail? People who actively resist necessary survival measures cannot be allowed to interfere with implementation. Her voice remained calm and professional. Resistance will be contained through whatever means prove most effective. She stood up and walked toward the door. You have 24 hours to decide whether you want to be part of the solution or part of the problem. After Chen left, I sat alone in my comfortable prison, thinking about Elena's final word. Remember, not resist or fight or escape, but remember. She wanted me to preserve what we'd learned, to document the truth regardless of what happened to us personally. That night, I used the room's basic amenities to create a primitive but functional recording device. If they planned to kill me or disappear me like so many others, I wanted to leave behind an account of what I'd discovered. But as morning approached, a different plan began to form. Chen had revealed more than she'd intended about the scope and coordination of the programs. If I could get that information to people who weren't part of the system, who might still be capable of resistance. The problem was finding a way to escape from a secure facility surrounded by professional guards and located in an unknown rural area. That's when I remembered the ventilation system I'd noticed during my supervised bathroom visits. The air circulation in the building was surprisingly robust, suggesting larger ducts than normal. If I could access the ductwork during the night shift when fewer guards were active. It was a desperate plan with minimal chance of success, but it was the only option I could identify. Elena and I had gathered enough evidence to prove the coordination and intent behind the sustainability programs. Now I needed to find a way to get that evidence to people who could act on it. Because if Chen was right about their timeline, there wasn't much time left. The countdown to 2030 was accelerating, and voluntary compliance was about to become mandatory enforcement. If someone didn't expose the truth soon, there might not be anyone left who remembered what freedom had felt like. That night I began my escape attempt, knowing that failure would likely mean death, but also knowing that staying silent would mean something even worse. The permanent victory of a system that viewed human autonomy as an obstacle to be eliminated. As I crawled through the ventilation system toward an uncertain freedom, Elena's voice echoed in my memory. Remember? I would remember, and if I survived I would make sure others remembered too. The ventilation system led me through the building's interior to a roof access point that emerged behind a cluster of communication equipment. From there, I could see the facility's perimeter, motion sensors, thermal cameras, and patrol routes that created overlapping coverage zones. But I could also see something the guards probably hadn't noticed. A service road that wound through the forest to a highway maintenance station about 2 miles away. Getting off the roof and across the monitored perimeter required timing and luck. I waited until the patrol cycles created a 40-second gap in coverage near the eastern fence, then dropped to the ground and sprinted toward the tree line. Motion sensors tracked my movement, but by the time the response team reached my position, I was already deep enough in the forest to avoid their thermal imaging. The service road was overgrown and clearly abandoned, but it provided a path through the woods that avoided the main security sensors. I followed it through the night, expecting pursuit teams to emerge from the darkness at any moment. But either my escape hadn't been discovered yet, or they were confident enough in their perimeter security to assume I couldn't have gotten far. The highway maintenance station was a collection of rusted equipment and storage sheds that hadn't been used in years. But it had what I needed, a working telephone line connected to the state highway system. Using calling cards I'd purchased weeks earlier, I began making contact with the network of researchers and journalists who'd been asking questions about the sustainability programs. The first 3 people I called had disconnected numbers. The 4th was answered by someone who claimed never to have heard of the person I was trying to reach. But the 5th call connected me with Alex Morrison, an investigative journalist who'd been documenting inconsistencies in climate policy implementation. "I know who you are," Alex said after I identified myself. "Elena Rodriguez contacted me before she disappeared. She said you might call if something happened to her. She's alive, but being held by people who don't officially exist. Can you prove what you're claiming?" "I have documents, communications, financial records, and organisational charts that prove coordination between agencies and corporations on 6 continents. Everything we need to demonstrate that the sustainability programs are components of a larger control system." Alex was quiet for a moment. "Where are the documents?" "Hidden in multiple locations. But first I need guarantees about how this information will be used. If you publish it the wrong way, they'll discredit it as conspiracy theorizing and use the attention to accelerate their timeline. What do you suggest?" "Simultaneous release across multiple platforms, with technical verification of the document authenticity and financial confirmation of the relationships we've mapped. Make it impossible to dismiss as fabricated evidence." Alex agreed to coordinate with contacts at other publications and technical organisations. We established a timeline for document delivery and verification, with publication scheduled for exactly 72 hours later. Enough time to properly authenticate the evidence, but not enough for the coordinating organisations to mount an effective suppression campaign. But first I had to retrieve the evidence from its hiding places without being captured. Over the next 2 days, I moved carefully between the locations where Elena and I had cached our research. Bank safety deposit boxes, storage lockers, and dead drops we'd established in case our primary archives were compromised. Each retrieval required elaborate security measures to avoid the surveillance networks that were undoubtedly looking for me. The most dangerous recovery was the data storage device Elena had hidden at a commercial facility across town from where she'd been captured. Getting to it required passing through areas that were certainly being monitored, using public transportation that would create records of my movement. I solved the surveillance problem by adopting the appearance and behaviour of the city's homeless population. Dirty clothes, unkempt appearance, and the kind of invisible desperation that made most people look away rather than remember faces. The disguise was psychologically difficult but operationally effective. Security cameras recorded me, but human attention filtered me out as irrelevant. The storage facility contained Elena's most sensitive archives, communication intercepts between coordination directors, financial tracking systems that showed money moving between organisations, and technical specifications for monitoring systems that hadn't been publicly announced. But it also contained something I hadn't expected, a video file labelled Emergency Broadcast Final Testimony. Elena had recorded the video shortly before her capture, speaking directly to the camera with the kind of urgency that suggested she knew she was running out of time. "If you're watching this, then the coordination has been exposed and I'm either dead or disappeared," she began. "What Marcus and I discovered represents the largest social engineering project in human history. Not a conspiracy by evil people, but a coordinated effort by people who genuinely believe that human freedom is incompatible with species survival." The video detailed information that Elena hadn't shared during our collaboration. Names of key coordinators, locations of planning facilities, and timelines for implementation phases that extended beyond 2030. "The 2030 target date is just the beginning," she explained. "Phase 3 establishes the control infrastructure, but Phase 4 involves what they call optimization protocols, systematic reduction of global population to what computer models indicate is the maximum sustainable level for technological civilization. Elena's final message was addressed to whoever would eventually broadcast the evidence. This isn't about politics or ideology. It's about whether human beings will be allowed to make their own choices about their lives, their communities, and their future. The people implementing these programs believe that freedom is a luxury we can't afford. They may be right about the severity of the crises we face, but they're wrong about the solution. I copied Elena's video along with the other archived materials, then destroyed the original storage system to prevent recovery by pursuit teams. By the time I reached the final rendezvous point, I was carrying comprehensive proof of coordination that spanned multiple continents and involved hundreds of organisations. Alex Morrison had assembled a coalition of journalists, researchers and technical experts who would simultaneously verify and publish the evidence. The plan was elegant in its simplicity, overwhelming the suppression capabilities of even the most sophisticated coordination networks by releasing information through so many channels that controlling the narrative would be impossible. On the appointed day, I delivered the complete archive to Alex's team and waited for the storm to break. The initial coverage was everything we'd hoped for. Detailed analysis of the financial relationships, technical verification of document authenticity, and expert commentary that confirmed the feasibility of the coordination we'd documented. For 48 hours, it seemed like we'd succeeded in exposing the truth. But then the counter-narrative began. The same news outlets that had initially covered the story began running follow-up pieces questioning the interpretation of the evidence. Expert sources appeared who offered alternative explanations for the coordination patterns, legitimate policy cooperation, standard bureaucratic relationships, normal business arrangements between contractors and agencies. The documents were real, these experts acknowledged, but they represented routine governmental and corporate activities rather than evidence of conspiracy. Climate policy required coordination, they explained. International cooperation was essential for addressing global challenges. The patterns we'd identified were exactly what effective governance should look like. Social media platforms began flagging our evidence as disputed information and potentially misleading content. Search algorithms modified to reduce the visibility of articles about the coordination. Discussion forums where people shared our documents were closed for policy violations. Within a week, public attention had moved on to other stories. The comprehensive evidence that Elena and I had risked our lives to gather was dismissed by mainstream discourse as another conspiracy theory promoted by people who didn't understand the complexity of modern governance. But we had succeeded in one crucial way. We'd created a permanent record that couldn't be completely suppressed. People who were looking for the truth could find it, could study the evidence, could draw their own conclusions about what it meant. And as the months passed, some of those people began to notice patterns that confirmed our warnings. 6 months later, I'm writing this from a cabin in rural Montana, living off-grid with cash transactions and avoiding any technology that could be used to track my location. The official story is that I suffered a mental breakdown and disappeared, leaving behind rambling conspiracy theories that no serious person would take seriously. Elena was released after 3 weeks of debriefing, but she's not the same person who risked everything to expose the truth. When she appears in public now, she speaks about the importance of international cooperation and the necessity of accepting temporary restrictions on personal freedom to address climate change. Her eyes have a vacant quality that suggests pharmaceutical management of her personality. Our evidence is still available to anyone persistent enough to look for it, but it's been successfully marginalised through the same techniques we documented: expert counter-narrative, algorithmic suppression, and social media manipulation. The truth exists, but it's been rendered effectively invisible to most people, and the implementation continues. Over the past 6 months, the changes have accelerated in ways that make our warnings seem prophetic. Major banks announce mandatory digital identity verification for all accounts, citing the need to prevent fraud and ensure regulatory compliance. Anyone without approved digital credentials finds themselves unable to access their money. Social media platforms implemented verified citizen requirements for posting or commenting, claiming the need to combat misinformation and protect democratic institutions. Anonymous speech has been effectively eliminated from digital communication. Streaming services, e-commerce sites, and online service providers rolled out verified citizen login systems but require government identification to access content. Entertainment and shopping have become privileges granted to compliant citizens. The carbon credit systems we documented are now operational in major cities, with personal behaviour tracked through smartphone monitoring, purchase surveillance, and periodic compliance verification. Citizens who fail to meet sustainability targets find themselves restricted from certain activities and locations. Employment in most major corporations now requires participation in behavioural modification programs that monitor everything from dietary choices to social media activity. Non-compliance results in professional exclusion that makes economic survival difficult. The changes happen gradually enough that each new restriction seems reasonable in isolation, justified by immediate crises, and presented as temporary measures that will be relaxed once stability is achieved. But people with longer memories can see the pattern. Each temporary restriction becomes permanent infrastructure for the next phase of control. I'm sitting in a library in a small town where they haven't yet installed biometric scanners for internet access. The computer I'm using doesn't require government identification, though I know that's changing. Signs posted throughout the building announce that new security measures will be implemented next month to ensure patron safety and prevent unauthorized access. On the news website, a UN representative is speaking about the success of digital identity programs in reducing fraud and improving service delivery. She announces that by 2030, all essential services will be tied to universal digital identification to ensure equitable access and protect vulnerable populations. As she speaks, the library computer screen freezes. A message appears: "Session terminated. Credentials required." I look around the library and notice that half the computers now display the same message. A technician is installing new card readers at each terminal, requiring government identification to access the internet. Outside the library windows, construction workers are installing biometric scanners at the entrance to the grocery store across the street. A small crowd has gathered to watch, some curious, others concerned. But no one is protesting. The changes are presented as upgrades to improve efficiency and security. I pack up my things and walk toward the exit, passing the information desk where librarians are helping patrons register for the new identification requirements. Their voices are cheerful and helpful as they explain how the new system will make library services more convenient and secure. The countdown Elena and I discovered isn't to some distant dystopian future. It's to the completion of a transformation that's already underway, implemented gradually enough that most people don't recognise the scope of what's changing. As I walk past the grocery store with its new biometric scanners, I whisper into the voice recorder I've been using to document these final observations. We're not waiting for 2030 anymore, it's already here. The recording device clicks off, and I realise this might be the last time I'm able to document the truth without sophisticated countermeasures to detect and suppress it. Soon, even whispered testimony in small-town libraries will be monitored and analysed by systems designed to prevent the spread of dangerous ideas. Elena was right about one thing. The people implementing these systems genuinely believe they're saving humanity from itself. They may even be correct about the severity of the crises we face, but they're fundamentally wrong about the solution. Freedom isn't a luxury that humanity can't afford. It's the foundation that makes everything else worth preserving. Without the right to make our own choices, to speak our own thoughts, and to determine our own futures, survival becomes indistinguishable from sophisticated imprisonment. The evidence Elena and I gathered will survive in hidden archives and encrypted networks, waiting for a generation that might remember what freedom felt like. Maybe someday, people will rediscover the courage to choose uncertainty over security, autonomy over optimization, and human dignity over species management. But that day feels very far away as I watch the scanners being installed and the last anonymous spaces disappearing into a world where every action, every movement, every thought is monitored, recorded, and evaluated by systems that know what's best for us better than we do ourselves. The 2030 directive isn't coming. It's here,